Chapter 622. I know, Your Royal Highness. Listen to me, I won't joke with my life. But I have a plan, maybe we can try it. Brando said in a tone unique to players who were eager to try anything. Princess Griffin frowned at him. Really? The half-elf princess's doubtful look was adorable in Brendel's eyes, and there was a rare girlish side to her. He nodded. Of course, if we can sneak under the nose of Georgandy Ridge, why not find a way to tear down the Door of Flame? But let's not talk about whether we can destroy the Door of Flame. Do you really believe that they can take us to avoid the army of Georgandy Ridge? Mr. Brando, they are witches, best at using words to confuse people. The princess did not hide her wariness, but this time she was on Brando's side. Her bright silver eyes showed an obvious expectation. She did not want Brando to be in danger. Your Royal Highness Princess of Corvado, when your grandfather, old Oberg, was still on the throne, I had already become a witch. The witches knew that their words would be overheard by the ravens, so they were careful with their words. Compared to the nobles who are hypocritical, you still trust them. Baba Shah chuckled, like an old crow, and replied in a hoarse and low voice. Bold people of the dark, who allowed you to call the former king by his name? Her Royal Highness reprimanded coldly. With a soft clang, the narrow and bright blade trembled slightly in the darkness. Brando hurriedly pressed her hand. Baba Shah. I misspoke, my lord. The old witch glanced at Princess Griffin with eyes as cold as wooden beads that had lost their luster. Baba Shah, the princess is not wrong. You are best at playing with people's hearts. Although witches never lie, they will leave a back door. I want you to swear to the pillar goddess of hell that you will not betray me. Can you do it? Brando pressed one hand on Griffin's hand and asked coldly. Baba Shah bowed deeply and said with some reverence, My lord is indeed clear about everything. We are willing to swear to the goddess of the purgatory pillar that we will never betray the Lord of Tonajol. Brando is our master, and if we do, let the blind and crippled Diaz drag us into the abyss. Princess Griffin saw Baba Shah put her hand over her heart. She had vaguely heard of the witch's vows to point to the heart. However, she realized that this oath seemed to be extremely terrifying to the other party. When she said the last sentence, the old witch even trembled slightly. She knew very little about witches and found it hard to believe that these cunning women would attach so much importance to a vow. For this reason, she looked at Brando in confusion. His silver eyes seemed to be seeking an answer. Don't worry, Your Highness. They won't lie to us now. Brando took the sword from her hand when she wasn't paying attention and gently put it back into the other party's scabbard. At the same time, he replied, the pillar goddess Modesty is their belief. Legend has it that Modesty was the first witch to steal black magic from the Sea of Magic. She passed on such spells to the first generation of prophets of the 12 witches, but later she was caught by the demons, nailed naked with a pillar in the hell of iron thorns, and tortured for eternity. The blind and crippled Diaz was her first student. She was addicted to darkness and became a monster. Witches who violate Modesty's oath will be dragged into eternal darkness by Diaz, who climbed out of the abyss. This is not a legend, but a real thing. Falling into complete darkness and losing the 5 senses is the most terrible punishment for witches. Since Baba Shah has made such an oath, she will never deceive us. Seeing that the princess was still puzzled, Brando added, This is the secret knowledge of the witches, and few outsiders know about it. Then how do you know? Good question. Brando didn't expect Her Highness to be able to keep her mind clear at this time. He quickly found a reason and said, Because Your Highness also knows that I have read the knowledge of the witches. They are as old as the witches. Although they are not enemies, they are at least competitors. They more or less know each other's secrets. Princess Griffin was skeptical. She looked back, so how sure is she that we won't be discovered? If it's just relying on the witch's spells, I don't think the commanders of Georgandy Ridge will not be unprepared. I have heard that there are more witches in the underground of Georgandy Ridge. So, whether as an enemy or an ally, they will not be unaware of the witch's means, right? Once again, Brando felt the calmness of the half-fairy princess. In fact, he had thought of this question, but on the one hand, Her Highness didn't even understand the common sense that there were only lords underground and no commanders. On the other hand, he had a deep understanding of Georgandy Ridge. Making a judgment based on only a little knowledge, the difference was obvious. He also looked back at Baba Shah, hoping to get an answer. His plan was still just an idea, but whether it could be implemented would require more details. No victory in war was won by slapping one's head, and he knew this very well. Compared to your muddle-headed grandfather, Her Highness is obviously much smarter. The truth is similar to what you guessed. Baba Shah mentioned Oberg the Sixth again. The half-elf girl pursed her lips to suppress her anger. The witches were so dismissive of worldly power, and in fact, this was one of the reasons why they were rejected by the world. But what puzzled her was that the old witch was so respectful to Brando, and she didn't know what kind of help Brando had given them. She listened to Baba Shah continue, but in addition to our spells, we also have some secret knowledge passed down from generation to generation. One of these secrets mentions that there is a hall under Ampier's seal that has been abandoned since ancient times. This hall is hidden between the gaps of the fjords and can lead to the hills north of the port. That's impossible, she finally couldn't help but say. It has been nearly 7 centuries since the late King Eric built the port of Ampier's seal here. For 7 centuries, in order to reassess whether the foundation of the Anderla Cathedral under the port is loose, the people of Ampier's seal have explored the surroundings of the port and the underground terrain more than once, but there have never been any rumors of ancient ruins. But Her Highness has to admit that long before the Erewhon people built the port, this place was no longer an ownerless place. Other than the Silver Elves, there have been other civilizations that have thrived here. The secret is a secret because it is not known. Baba Shah laughed. I remember now. Are you talking about the Seeping Ancient Passage? Brando remembered that there was such an ancient ruin near Ampier's seal, but it had been weathered for too long, leaving a passage between the underground cliffs. There was a broodmother that had lived for who knows how many years, a level 57 boss. To be honest, if he could, he didn't want to provoke that thing at all. In the narrow terrain, a giant broodmother with the strength of the elemental truth, coupled with her countless descendants and omnipresent spider webs, made Brando's hair stand on end. The key was that he had never heard that the ancient passage could lead to the hills north of Ampier's seal, only that one side of the ancient passage went deep into the mountains of Erech. My lord, in fact, we don't know what the situation below the hall is like. Hearing Brando say this, Baba Shah was even more certain of his identity. Everything was as the prophecy said, the secrets of the witches were like a big open book in his eyes, which could be read at will. But since the Lord also knows about this passage, it means that it must exist. Princess Griffin also believed this time, because Brando certainly wouldn't lie to her. She turned her head. Brando, is what she said true? I've heard of such an ancient passage. Brando's forehead was sweating, and he almost accidentally exposed himself again. He couldn't help but secretly curse Baba Shah, these old witches, for using the so-called secret of the witches to trick him. But this passage really leads to the hills north of Ampier's seal. Well, the literature of the wizards didn't mention this. Brando felt that if this went on, the information on the forum would completely become the library of the wizards. This is a secret passed down from generation to generation, so naturally it can't be wrong. This passage connects to the mountains on one side, and leads to the hills in the north on the other. That should be right, it basically matches what I know. Brando was sure that there might be a secret passage under the ancient passage. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but be very curious. In the past, because it was close to Ampier's seal, there were a lot of players who explored this ancient passage, but no one found this other secret passage in decades. After all, It was impossible to set up a secret passage inexplicably in the game, there must be corresponding benefits in it. Thinking of this, Brando's heart burned with a raging fire of anticipation. In the Amber Sword, there were too few secrets that had not been explored and discovered in the Land of Order. He didn't expect to meet one today. He looked up, Baba Shah, if I remember correctly. The entrance to the underground passage should be some distance from here, right? Yes, my lord. Baba Shah replied respectfully, the entrance should be east of Randon's Foothill Manor. Who has a map? I do. Count Audine immediately took a wooden cylinder from his waist, opened the stopper, and took out a waterproof parchment map. The accompanying knight immediately spread it out, and the parchment map spread on the ground was about half the size of a person. It was a full map of the surrounding areas of Ampere Seal. This kind of high-precision map was not common in this era. Even in the military, it was the most important and highly confidential, and it was worth at least 10,000 gold on the black market. Back then, the players didn't have such awesome goods in their hands. Brando didn't expect Count Audine to carry such a thing with him. He couldn't help but praise, I didn't expect Count Audine to carry such a good thing with him. You're really well prepared. Count Audine looked at Princess Griffin a little embarrassedly, it was Her Royal Highness who asked me to bring it. Brando immediately glanced at the half-elf girl beside him, but unfortunately, Her Royal Highness didn't have much expression on her face. She even frowned slightly. He couldn't help but sigh and look at the map. On the map, there is a place called Silver Point Hill east of Randon's Foothill Manor. If he remembers correctly, the secret entrance to the ancient passage should be near there. But before that, there was a problem. If I remember correctly, the secret entrance to the ancient passage should be sealed by ancient magic. Can you find a way to open that seal? Brando looked up at Baba Shah. Of course, it was actually the witches who sealed the ancient passage, my lord. Baba Shah replied with a little pride. She did have the right to be proud. The witches in Wonde had a very long history. They used to follow the Darkness Dragon and had a lot of dark secrets and history unknown to others. Opening that secret door requires a ceremony, and only 20 people can pass through at a time. But once through that passage, whether it's going north to the hills north of Ampere Seal, or south to the mountains of Erech, it's all up to my lord. In other words, we have to enter that ancient passage no matter what? Princess Griffin asked. More or less, unless we're willing to fight our way out, but I'm afraid the chances are slim, Brando said. But Princess Griffin still frowned, but they don't know the specific situation under the ancient passage. Whether there will be any danger down there is also an uncertain thing. In any case, it's better than waiting for death, Brando added, besides, I actually know what's down there, and I'm at least 80% sure. Please believe me, Your Highness. The princess glanced at him and finally nodded, well, I believe you. One more thing. At this time, Count Audine suddenly said from the side. Under everyone's gaze, he walked up and pointed to a point on the parchment map. In a short while, the map was covered with water, and said, we still have some way to go from here to there. Just now, we saw at least one army of Jorgandi Ridge entering the forest from the top of the mountain. If we go in this direction, will we run into them head-on? Brando looked at the map and frowned deeply. He knew that what Count Audine said was true. He had seen with his own eyes on the top of the mountain that there were sparks outside the port of Ampere Seal. That was probably the light of lava and torches. If they continued to move north like this, the chances of running into them were very high, not to mention the countless harpies overhead. He pursed his lips and frowned as he exchanged glances with the princess. Both of them saw the same meaning in each other's eyes. We need to ask for backup. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 623. Daddy. Daddy. Help me, the little girl cried as she crawled, her tears and mucus mixed together on her little face. Her white dress was already black and stained with black and red. The village outside Fort Bunyuo looked as if it had been smeared with blood. The streets, wells, and everywhere within sight were stained with blood. The demons from the Sulphur River strung the residents who could not escape in time on hooks, dragged them out of the houses, cruelly killed them, and then hung them on the trees in the village. The little girl screamed for her father, but her father might have already become one of these unlucky ones. However, the demons seemed to be playing with this little prey, deriving great pleasure from the little girl's uneasiness and panic. They let her struggle in a pool of blood and mud, but every time she crawled a distance, a hellhound would come up and bite her white calf, dragging her back. The little girl screamed and struggled, and the little demons not far away laughed in unison. This was like a feast for them. They pulled out a dying young girl from the pile of corpses, grabbed her long flaxen hair with their claws, and then cut open her chest with a sharp knife. They dug out her heart amidst the splattering blood, and then snatched it and swallowed it whole. When the little girl saw this scene, she was completely scared out of her wits. When the hellhound came to her side, it seemed to have lost interest and bit her. Then, it shook its huge head. The little girl's lifeless body swayed along with its huge mouth like a broken doll. But it was at this time that the hellhound creature, which was as tall as a man and looked like a giant wolf with dark fur and a huge collar, suddenly raised its head, shook its ears, and showed a vigilant look in its flaming eyes. A sharp arrow whizzed through the night sky from afar, parting the fierce wind and heavy rain. The arrow hit its smoky nostril, and the creature with the stench of sulfur instantly let out a miserable cry, its entire body flipping backward. A female knight rushed out of the rain, the sword in her hand like a sharp thorn with a cold light. Her eyes were full of hatred, and she lifted the hellhound's chin high with one hand. Flames burned from under the hellhound's fur, burning her fingers, but she gritted her teeth and pushed the sword upward. The sword went straight into the hilt. Die, demon! Go back to hell! The hellhound let out a mournful wail. Hot and stinking blood spurted out from the wound on its throat, splashing onto Freya's face. Then, more night rushed out of the rain. Bess held a longbow and shot one imp with each arrow, killing them in the distance. These red-skinned malevolent spirits were only at the upper level of iron rank. They were not even as strong as the hellhound that Freya had killed. The knight passed by Freya and shouted the name of the knight. However, Freya seemed to have lost all the strength in her body as she heavily piled up the hellhound's corpse on the ground. Then, she bent down and carefully picked up the little girl. The little girl was badly mutilated from her neck to her chest. Her eyes were half closed, and her mouth was opening and closing, spitting out blood and pieces of internal organs. She tried to make a sound with great difficulty. Sister, it hurts. Freya bit her lower lip, and tears flowed out uncontrollably. The scene in front of her was familiar. It had played out in Buchi, in Erewhon, and many other places. She had experienced the same pain. The flames of war burned the earth, but the ones suffering in the flames were not the nobles of the kingdom, but the people. In the past year, the kingdom seemed to have returned to peace, but the same pain repeated again and again. This time, it was the people of Cruz and the nobles of the north who brought this disaster. Who would be next? Erewhon was powerless to change, just like she was powerless to save the little girl in her arms. Freya felt that she could only watch her sister die weakly. The little girl finally lost her warmth in her arms. Brando, what should I do? Freya gently put her down and could not help but mutter to herself. She turned around and saw that Bess had come behind the knight and gently patted her back. Freya, this is war. You have to learn to get used to it. She sighed and replied. But when will Erewhon end the war? When it is stronger, so strong that no one can control our fate. One day, Bess replied firmly, Her Royal Highness will do it and no longer rely on the rotten nobles of the north. Really? Freya could not help but think of what Brando had told her. But wasn't the king's party also a part of the nobles? Could those nobles really understand this pain? The more she knew, the darker and deeper history seemed in her eyes. It was like a giant mouth that wanted to swallow her whole. But then she thought of the pair of determined eyes and the sea of fire in Butchie. Why was Brando always so confident? The fog that made everyone feel uneasy didn't seem to exist in front of him. Had he already seen the other end of history, the inevitable ending? The girl was in a daze. Bunyuo's position was like the bottom of a scorched pot. Some sticks were erected far and near on the scorched earth, and some still retained a few broken flags. Scorching hot fragments of armor were scattered all over the ground. Broken human bodies, hands, feet, and other body parts were everywhere. The devil's offensive finally came to an end, but it brought an unparalleled shock to people's hearts. The defeated soldiers retreated one after another, and finally rebuilt a line of defense after retreating nearly 4 or 5 miles. The genius of the Hong Kong people, Viscount von Downing, looked at the big pits in the distance and gnashed his teeth in hatred. When the big men of the Northern Coalition Army cried and asked to retreat, he should have killed them all. They were a bunch of cowards. He was lucky to survive the battle in Mar Highland. Although he was captured, he was quickly exchanged back, which made him very embarrassed. So he urgently needed a victory to prove himself. The glory of a soldier was to move forward, especially in such a war. Killing a few more devils was the qualification for future promotion. But the devil's attack was so daunting that Viscount von Downing didn't know if he still had a chance. On the other side of the horizon, a bright fire was burning, as if the heavy rain was grease, making the flames even more dazzling. Fort Bunyuo was finished. He didn't care how many people died there or who died. It had nothing to do with him, but he at least understood that this line of defense had become precarious. He saw several knights in the White Lion Legion uniform walking past him. Those White Lions seemed to be organizing a counterattack. He couldn't help but spit. Such a battle was unbearable. They didn't even know the enemy's fighting style. The commanders were really a bunch of idiots. Viscount von Downing couldn't help but look at the sky. His eyes couldn't penetrate the rain, but he could still see the shadow of Erwin's Royal First Fleet hanging in midair. His eyes were deep, and no one knew what he was thinking for a while. Countess Janelesu corrected the time on her pocket watch for the last time. The fleet had completely unfolded in the direction of the Northern Devil Army. All the cannon doors on the ship's side had been opened, as if countless black holes had opened. The sun had completely sunk below the horizon, and the heavy rain had turned into a pitch-black darkness where one couldn't even see one's own fingers. But there was still a string of residual light in the sky, as well as a mottled light mixed with flames. The light fell on the Count's resolute face, outlining a few straight lines. The middle-aged man looked back and glanced at the crew's people. There are still 15 minutes. Almost all the high-ranking members of the coalition forces, crew's people, Erwin people, were now gathered on the deck. Under Archbishop Wood's gaze, Seal placed a crystal ball in the middle of the room, and on the crystal ball was Brendel's image. At the same time, Brando was also looking at the image of Wood on the crystal ball that Baba Shah had put on the parchment map. Brando, in 15 minutes, the crew's people and Erwin people will launch a general attack against the Devil Army from the Sulphur River, which is several times their number. We will attract attention for you. Wood, who was wearing the robe of the Archbishop, looked serious. But can you really find a way to tear down those doors of flame? I can't guarantee it. Brando replied seriously. But you and I both know what will happen if I don't succeed, so we have to do it. Me and you, it's the same, Lord Archbishop. He smiled slightly. Wood looked deeply at Brando. If he could, this was one of the faces he didn't want to see the most. The plan in Ampere Seal was almost a nightmare for him. The situation at the port had completely deteriorated. If the Northern Coalition forces couldn't defeat the devils, then the Cruz Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire were likely to pay a heavy price together. Those were 3 doors of flame, and no one knew better than him the importance of it. No, there was one person who might be at least as clear as him. Wood stared at him. He didn't understand why this young man knew so much inside information. As soon as Brando opened his mouth, the northern nobles were in an uproar. Is this guy trying to shirk responsibility? Lord Archbishop, if he can't guarantee it, what's the point of us launching a desperate charge against the devils here? We're just like fools. Is Her Royal Highness trying to find a way to consume the strength of her allies? Let's just defend and wait for reinforcements. The Holy Cathedral of Fire won't leave us alone. On the other side of the crystal ball, Princess Griffin also grabbed Brando's sleeve. She looked at him angrily and asked, Mr. Brando, you said that we should act according to the circumstances. They are devils, Your Royal Highness. I know, but you don't have to take unnecessary risks. Her Royal Highness tried to suppress her anger. Mr. Brando, we can defeat them in the end. I don't support your personal heroism. Although it's romantic, it's not the right way to do it. Brando sighed and stretched out his hand to gently tidy up the messy hair on Her Royal Highness' forehead. His action shocked everyone around him. Even the eldest princess herself froze, but Brando didn't care. To be honest, he didn't know if he could go back alive. As early as the moment he made the decision, he knew what kind of battle he would face next. Have you seen a real devil army, Your Royal Highness? He asked softly. Have you seen a real devil army? A bunch of idiots. Wood slowly turned his head, and everyone could hear the anger in the Archbishop's voice. The northern nobles were arrogant, but they had to bow their heads in front of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Everyone was silent for a moment. Devils are the mortal enemies of order and civilization, Your Royal Highness. They are rebellious. Although they are not subordinates of the Twilight Dragon, they were born from chaos. They were born to tear everything apart. Everything beautiful and cherished is their enemy. And their pleasure is based on the pain and despair of mortals. The Holy Cathedral fights against the cultists not to suppress the voices of opposition. Those believers of chaos who obey the Twilight Dragon, their faith is to tear the world apart and make our world cease to exist. However, some people here today, some nobles who should be responsible for guiding the people, have foolishly ignored this point, which is regrettable. There are still people who remember the devil disaster in the wilderness of the 4 territories. The devils that came out of the open portal destroyed everything. Almost all the creatures in the whole kingdom completely disappeared. Who will save them? No one. Even the Holy Cathedral can't do it. Your Royal Highness, have you seen the devils walking on the earth, and the flames of sulfur burning everything behind them? I have seen it. At that time, I was not a high-ranking priest of the Holy Cathedral. Millions of devils came to the world, and the Holy Cathedral used 10 years of mental and physical effort to drive them back to the Sulphur River. Today, Erwin is going to face the same fate. Back then, on the border of Antiburo, it was only a crack that opened. Today, there are 3 complete portals, Wood said quietly. He was not afraid to reveal the secrets of the Holy Cathedral, because if today's matter could not be resolved, his political life would be completely over, and he would become a sinner. More importantly, the reputation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would suffer an unimaginable blow. On the other side, Brando was silent for a moment and decided to tell the truth. Your Royal Highness, Erwin will turn into a piece of scorched earth. Although we may be able to rebuild it one day, there is still a glimmer of hope, isn't there? There were millions of lives here, and that might have nothing to do with him. He would not see them suffer in the flames, he would not see them die in pain, and he would not even hear their cries before they died. Everything seemed to have nothing to do with him, and he could still methodically implement his plan to rebuild this ancient kingdom on the wasteland. At least Valhalla was still there, wasn't it? Maybe it was. But Brando couldn't convince himself that he could ignore it. He could tell himself that he didn't see all this, but he couldn't deceive the truest feelings in his heart. Everyone tried to escape all the time, but everyone had the truest self in their heart, which told them what was right and what was wrong. No one was born a hero, but now at least he could give it a try. As he had experienced everything, he understood that there was only one thing in the world that could not be made up for. That was regret. Her Royal Highness looked at him in a daze. Mr. Brando, your Royal Highness, you said you believed in me. You. Princess Griffin gritted her teeth, struggled for a moment, but finally let go of her hand. Well, I understand, Brando nodded to her, then he turned his head and looked at the image of Archbishop Wood on the crystal bowl. It seems that we have reached an agreement. Congratulations, Archbishop. Wood nodded, but he sighed slightly in his heart. The Archbishop couldn't help but lower his eyelids slightly. He was indeed too rash. Maybe he shouldn't have condoned all this from the beginning. May Lady Martha in heaven bless us. I hope that Erwin's fate is not over. He had never wanted Erwin to continue to exist so much. At least as a cruise man and the Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral, today was probably the day he deeply hoped that this country would continue to exist. Brando also smiled. Yes, I hope the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not violate the will of the late King Gretel too much. Otherwise, it would be too unlucky for me to be implicated, wouldn't it? Wood snorted. P.S. When I was writing, I was killing pigs, but I found that I was disconnected after writing. I can't go up now. H. Pig, give me your life. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 624. The demons seemed to have discovered the actions of the humans in advance, and countless harpies flew into the sky in the starless night. The flagship of the Erwin Royal Fleet, HMS Victory, opened the curtains of the war with its artillery barrage. A test shot and a flash of light exploded among the harpies. The crossbowmen on the side of the ship saw that the layers of feathers almost covered the strong light of the explosion, and the shell was like a stone thrown into the sea. Countless enemies. The wizard observed the effect of the artillery barrage through the porthole of the cannon door, and the light of the explosion made his face pale. He took a sheet of paper filled with forms from the side and recorded the amount of charges and magic power injected on it. The herald took the form from him and gave the order. A moment later, the entire fleet roared, and countless shells whistled into the airtight group of harpies. A flash of explosion burst between these monsters, and the shock wave of the explosion almost formed a wave of blood, pushing countless feathers and limbs forward, and the mutilated body parts fell like rain. The roar in the rainy night awakened the dormant earth, and the rumbling sound seemed to revive the forest from Bunyuo to the silver-scabbard sea cliff. The imagined roar of blood flowing in the huge blood vessels under the surface, and every soldier felt the ground under their feet tremble slightly, like a living creature. The flash of the explosion overhead lit up the space between heaven and earth, and at a glance, one could see a panoramic view of the potholed battlefield near Fort Bunyuo. Flags were erected on the edge of the battlefield, and then a human army appeared in sight. The human coalition army began to attack. The goal of the Erwin and crews was to seize several villages near Fort Bunyuo to attract the demons to put more troops into the main battlefield, but the fireballs of the demon warlocks on top of Fort Bunyuo brought great trouble to the entire battlefield, and the progress of the battle was slower than expected. Freya and her sergeants and the Lantern Island Knight were moving briskly along a forest in the middle of the battlefield, and they soon arrived near Fort Bunyuo. Their goal was to seize the castle. After observing the terrain, Freya immediately ordered the attack. Hundreds of Anthony Knight immediately attacked a gap in the castle wall that had collapsed. The imps in the gap were no match for them. These skinny inferior demons were known for their cowardice in the Sulphur River. They had neither magic nor combat skills. The superior demons did not even acknowledge them as demons. They only treated them as food or even currency that could be exchanged. After a few of their companions were killed, these seemingly cruel and terrifying monsters revealed their true nature and dispersed. The knights soon arrived at the top of the city wall. The girl from the countryside of Butchie took the lead and was delighted to see the rapid progress of her side's offensive. At this rate, it would take less than a quarter of an hour to capture Fort Bunuo. But at this moment, a demon warlock appeared at the top of the gap. Unlike human wizards who wore long robes, these demon warlocks had bulging muscles and huge horns on their heads. Like the lower demons, they did not have any decorations on their bodies. They held a burning fireball in their hands and threw it down. It exploded among the knight who rushed to the front. The shockwave from the explosion caused the Lantern Island's knights to stagger. A flying pebble even scratched Freya's face, causing the girl's face to be immediately covered in blood. But she ignored the burning pain and immediately shouted, "Everyone, follow me and rush up in one go. Don't give it a chance to cast another spell." With that, she took the lead and climbed the gravel to rush up to the gap. Two imps summoned by the demon warlock rushed at her, one on the left and one on the right, but Freya raised her shield to block them, then threw them back and threw them off the city wall. Her heroic act greatly boosted the morale of the Lantern Island knight. The knights shouted the name of the knight and rushed to the city wall. However, Freya also attracted the attention of the demon warlocks. Soon, more imps surrounded her, forcing her to slow down. The surrounding knight quickly passed her and rushed to the city wall. However, another huge figure appeared on the city wall. It was a Tauren. The monster from Jorgendy Ridge appeared without warning. It was obvious that it had been lying in ambush behind the city wall since the beginning, waiting for the human knight to walk into the trap. The monster was at least as tall as 3 men, and it held a giant axe that was bigger than itself. It stood there like a huge windmill, and it also swept the giant axe in its hand forward like the blades of a windmill. The Lantern Island knights who were charging at the front let out a scream and were cut in half at the waist. The Minotaur roared angrily and rushed down along the collapsed city wall, sweeping all the humans and demons in front of him out of the city. The human knight was no match for it at all. The monster soon came in front of Freya, raised its axe and swept it violently. "Be careful, Freya." Freya even heard the warning from Bess behind her. At that moment, she was very nervous. She had never seen such a huge monster, except for the terrible wind elemental in the Mar Highlands. However, the feeling of seeing it from afar was different from fighting it up close. The huge black axe brought great psychological pressure to her. If it hit, she would be dead. No, she must not die here. Brando was still in front. She had to help him take this place. Only then would the demons shift their attention to the main battlefield. Everything she learned in the Royal Knight Academy seemed to be clear at once. At the last moment, her heart was calm, as if there was some special power flowing in her body. This feeling was exactly the same as the moment she got the Lionheart sword. The Tauren's giant axe arrived in an instant. Freya lowered her head and dodged the attack. At the same time, she jumped forward and subconsciously grabbed the place where the handle and the face of the axe were connected. The Tauren didn't have time to see it clearly and swung the axe to the highest point. Freya let go of her hand and jumped up to land on its huge axe face. The axe face was almost a meter wide, enough for her to stand on. Then she jumped again and landed steadily on the back of the Tauren's neck. This series of actions was completed in an instant, and no one had time to react. But the Tauren finally realized that the prey in front of it had somehow gotten on its back. It let out an angry moo and reached out to grab Freya on its back. But Freya dodged to the side and dodged the monster's straw-matted hand. At the same time, she gritted her teeth and raised the Lionheart sword high. At that moment, the sword radiated a bright light, bright like a beam of ice-blue flame, illuminating the entire Fort Bunyuo and the bright eyes of the girl from the countryside of Buchi. It was like a reenactment of the scene from that day. A pair of silver wings of light stretched out from behind Freya, and the Valkyrie's battle marks reappeared. The female knight clamped the Tauren's neck with her legs, clenched the sword with both hands, and plunged it down the monster's spine. With a whoosh, the flashing Lionheart sword penetrated the Tauren's neck like cutting tofu. The Tauren suddenly let out a whine. It seemed to have gone mad as it dropped its giant axe and slapped its neck with its hand. This time, Freya couldn't avoid it. She heard a crack behind her, and a sharp pain came. Her internal organs were almost displaced. The girl's vision turned black, and her body fell back subconsciously, but her hand was still holding the hilt of the Lionheart sword. She took the opportunity to pull the sword out, and the black blood on the Tauren's body suddenly gushed out. Freya coughed up a mouthful of blood, raised the sword again, and plunged it into the back of the Tauren's head. This time, the monster finally couldn't withstand such a heavy injury and fell forward, crashing into the collapsed city wall with a loud crash. Everyone was shocked. Freya. Bess, who went with Freya, ran towards the Tauren's corpse like a madwoman. The cadets of the Royal Knight Academy were originally comrades, and Freya was one of the few females in the academy, so their relationship was even better. But at this time, the girl from Buchi's countryside was dizzy, but there was only one thing in her mind. She couldn't stop. She had already learned everything from the county. Brando was still in front of her, and she knew what he wanted to do. She also knew what she wanted to do. Freya could no longer be the useless Buchi's militia captain. She wanted to change Buchi, and change everyone's fate. Brando could help her. But she was no longer the ignorant girl from the countryside. She had learned a lot. She even vaguely felt that she might have seen what Brando saw, and that was what the princess was pursuing. It wasn't just an ideal, it was a beautiful vision. When would Erwin be able to escape his fate? Bess said that the tragedy of Buchi would not repeat itself until the kingdom became stronger. But Brando told her that it wasn't just a noble's task. The princess told her that everyone had to use their own sword to defend their dignity. Freya. Bess came to the girl's side and helped her up. The knights of Lantern Island couldn't help but cheer when they saw the female knight covered in blood. Freya gritted her teeth and raised the Lionheart sword in her hand. The bright blade of the sword was more like a flag, and this flag was reflected in everyone's eyes. It was the Lionheart sword, a flag of victory, as if it symbolized Erwin's uprightness and unyielding spirit. Freya. 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 Everyone's blood was boiling, and the knights shouted the name of their temporary commander and launched an attack on the city wall. There were no more minotaurs on the city wall. Even the army of demons could not use such high-level creatures as consumables. After all, this was no longer the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints thousands of years ago. Freya watched the black and red torrents pour into Fort Bunyuo, but her heart was calm. Bess, help me up. What, you're hurt like this? The short-haired girl complained, I promised the commander to take good care of you, and now I can't keep my precious magic longbow. Freya couldn't help but cough and laugh. She knew that Brando would never argue with her for this reason. She felt that she was in terrible pain, but she had never been so relaxed for a moment. Something in her heart had left her, but it had doubled in maturity. I seem to have suddenly understood something, Bess. What do you understand? In another time and space, Erwin's future Valkyrie smiled. At that moment, she finally understood that those words were not meant for her, but for Brando to answer his own question. War will happen, and we can only choose to accept it. We were born in a very bad era, and we can't choose our era. But we can try to change it. Maybe it won't change anything, but at least we have fought together with many people to achieve it. Such memories are precious. Do you know the word companion? No matter how far you go, there will be many people with you. You will never be alone. She, he, everyone will move forward with Erwin. Forever. The situation on the battlefield changed, and the demons finally began to notice that the humans' frontal offensive was more ferocious than they expected. Although losing Fort Bunyuo was not a big deal, it at least showed that the weak opponent on the opposite side still had the strength to fight back. They began to throw the army behind Georgandy Ridge into the frontal battlefield, trying to crush the last hope of these poor creatures in one fell swoop. Far away in the forest near Ampere Seal, the knights looked up at the flashes in the sky like fireworks, but they were all speechless. The group understood what it was. The flash lasted for about a quarter of an hour, and the old witch Babasha finally brought back her companions. As Brando had expected, those were the witches who lived in seclusion in Erewhon. Most of them were on par with Babasha in strength, and seemed to be led by Babasha. They all expressed their loyalty to Brando one by one, and even made an oath, of course, avoiding the attention of others. Time was of the essence, and Brando had no time to appease these new subordinates. Under his orders, everyone packed up and headed north. The knight had to walk through the forest in the dark and rain, and sometimes even had to wade through one or two swollen mountain streams. Fortunately, except for the princess, most of the entourage had the strength of silver and above, and the bad weather could only cause them a little trouble at best. They bypassed a few low hills and traveled north for more than 20 minutes, and soon arrived at the place. The secret door was located in a valley surrounded by 12 hazel trees, just as Brando remembered. But when they came out of the woodland, they saw an open space with neither a door nor anything that could be called man-made. Everyone stopped and couldn't help but cast doubtful glances at Brando. Brando didn't say anything, knowing what was going on in his heart. But he was already quite cautious, and only waited for Babasha to explain. There is an illusion here that only a witch can break. Sure enough. P.S. 4,000 words. Please for votes. I want any vote. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 625. Each of the 12 witches stood under a hazelnut tree and began to chant an ancient song. 7 stone pillars suddenly broke out of the ground silently on the grassland in the forest, and a huge holy white rock rose from the soil in the middle of the stone pillars. There was a crack in the rock, and the black hole looked like the gate to hell. It was easy to see that the stone gate and stone pillars were artificially carved from the natural rock. There were also some curved words on it, which had been eroded and blurred. Brando could barely distinguish that it should be an ancient dwarven text. My lord, this gate can only last for half a quarter of an hour. Please decide who you want to take with you. As soon as the white rock appeared, Babasha immediately said in a hoarse voice. Brando had already decided on the candidates in his heart. Babasha, you choose 5 reliable men to go in with me first. Count Audine, you lead the night and later. The rest of you, protect Her Royal Highness. I want you to swear to the goddess of the pillars of purgatory. Please rest assured, Mr. Brando. Count Audine replied with a knight's salute. His relationship with Brando seemed to have naturally become one of superior and subordinate, but the Count was not narrow-minded. He understood that Brando was far more qualified to give orders here than he was, so he did not feel anything wrong. The witches respectfully did as they were told, and Count Audine sighed again. Although the witches occasionally made some transactions with secular power, they would never behave so respectfully. He did not really believe the old witch's statement that Brando had helped them, but he suspected Brando's other experience. He already knew that Brando was the descendant of Sword Saint Darius, and also knew that Brando had once studied under a very powerful, hermit wizard. Count Audine suspected that it was Tolman, so he subconsciously attributed the relationship between the witches and Brando to the fact that they might have been indebted to the master of the mithril castle. Mr. Brando, the half-elf girl had just opened her mouth when she was interrupted by Brando. Your Highness, please stay here and let me feel at ease. Because whether it's you or me, Erwin needs someone to know how it should proceed in the future. I may be a little arrogant to say this, but I don't want my efforts to be in vain. Princess Griffin looked at him carefully. Then I order you to come back. Can you do that? Brando did not answer. How was he supposed to answer? He wasn't sure either. Perhaps the people from Georgandy Ridge were just a bunch of brainless cavemen. They never thought that there would be a secret passage to the hills north of Ampere Seal. Therefore, they came out in full force, or only left a reserve team behind, allowing him to easily tear down the door of flame. Of course, he hoped so too. However, he knew in his heart that it was more likely to be the opposite. The demons were heavily guarding the portal, and they only had a slim chance of success. He did not know what he was about to face. Even when he had fought his way out of the encirclement in Butchie, he had not felt so uncertain. History had completely changed, and for the first time, he could not see the inevitable result behind the fog. However, there was surprisingly no fear in his heart. His mind was clear, and he knew exactly what he was going to do. Then it's a promise, Brando smiled. If I'm unlucky and die, I'll let Count Audine send my body back. This joke was not very clever. The princess frowned and looked at him. She only said 2 words, live. I'll do my best. No one wants to die, Your Highness. Princess Griffin just looked at him quietly, which made Brando feel very strange. He thought that this ambiguous answer would be reprimanded, but in any case, he had already made a decision. Baba Shah had already chosen the candidates, and she brought the 5 witches to meet him. One of the 5 witches was said to be Babash's niece. She was a thin middle-aged woman in her 60s, and the other 3 were also close to Baba Shah. The last one surprised Brando slightly. It was a little girl holding a honey jar. She was less than half his height, with faint freckles on the tip of her nose, and a pair of amber eyes looking at him curiously. Baba Shah introduced her as her adopted daughter. Although she was only 14 years old, she already had the strength of a silver rank. Brando asked her what her name was, and the little girl replied crisply, Sugar Jar. Good name. Brando could not help but look at the honey jar she was holding, thinking that this little girl must like to eat sugar. He just did not know if the witches would have tooth decay. Perhaps they would not. After saying goodbye to the princess, he took the witches into the cave, and the 12th night followed. In the crevice of the rock was a narrow space, only about 3 people could walk side by side. There were obvious traces of artificial steps on the ground. At this time, someone behind them lit a torch with a flint, and the smell of pine nut oil suddenly filled the cave, but everyone could see the surrounding environment. The rocks on both sides were like knives, and in the middle, there was a staircase cut from between the rocks leading straight to the ground. It was not much different from Brando's memory, but the dust was so thick that he drew a trace on the wall with his finger. Brando thought that the first player who discovered this place must have felt the same way. But then there was a sudden exclamation behind him. Brando hurriedly turned his head, and then he saw a familiar slender figure coming in from the outside. The crack in the rock closed behind her, naturally merging into the surrounding rock walls without leaving a trace. It was Princess Griffin. Your Royal Highness, you. Brando almost blacked out. He finally understood what the princess's last quiet glance meant. It turned out that she wanted him to relax his vigilance, and the tragedy was that he really walked into the trap. Mr. Brando, you are not very smart. Well, I admit that I am a fool. But I will order Baba Shah to take you out of another secret passage, Your Royal Highness, you can't stop me. Brando replied snappily. Unless you kill me, Princess Griffin replied coldly. Otherwise, no one can take me away. You can try, Mr. Brando. I dare to use my actions to practice my every word. Your Royal Highness. Don't be so. Brando wanted to say stubborn, but he suddenly remembered that the princess was famous for her stubbornness in history. She might really do what she said. He suddenly felt a headache coming on. He suddenly missed the obedient Amandina, or at least Scarlet and Metasha were much less worrisome than the princess. Mr. Brando, I said that you are not smart, not because I lied to you. The princess saw the hesitation on his face, and her tone softened a little. Have you ever thought that if you fail, there will still be a ruin? The devil will destroy all of this, didn't you already tell me? I want to be with you and watch you save this ancient kingdom with your own hands. If you fail, the princess looked at him quietly, I will be buried with you for this kingdom. I will at least bury our ideals under the dust with my own hands. I want to die by my knight's side. Brando felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't know if the princess meant to say that, but when he saw the serious look in the half-elf girl's eyes, he suddenly felt that he had been seen through by her. But he had to admit that he did not think of this. If he failed, Erwin would be destroyed by the devil's invasion. After losing him in Valhalla, whether the people of Erwin could rebuild a kingdom from the ruins, whether the rebuilt kingdom would bear the same beliefs, everything was still unknown. Whether or not Erwin's people would be able to survive the calamity was still a question. After losing the familiar name of the land, would this kingdom still be the Erwin he was familiar with? Not necessarily. Her Royal Highness saw far more clearly than he did, perhaps this was the difference between him and her. After all, she was a native of this kingdom, and no matter how much he understood the history of this ancient kingdom, he only carried half of Brando's feelings. He sighed. Your Royal Highness, you and I, since you admit that I am your knight, then I have to take the responsibility of protecting you. In the future, you must not be so stubborn. He said, half complaining and half warning. Princess Griffin's eyes softened a little. Babasha, you lead the way. Brando said unhappily. Yes, my lord. Babasha glanced at the princess, smiled mysteriously, and walked forward with the torch. The light of the torch extended down the tunnel, and the air quickly left the humid atmosphere outside and became dry. The pine resin torch occasionally burst out one or two sparks, landing on Babasha's witch hat. Other than that, it was difficult to hear any other sound in this quiet underground. Of course, the rustling footsteps of the group was an exception. Brando felt that Her Royal Highness beside him was a little nervous, which was not surprising. Although she was born with all kinds of aristocratic education that made her have to remain calm and collected at all times, she was still a noble girl born in the royal family. In her life, she had probably never had the experience of exploring the wild, let alone exploring the underground of an ancient castle. Anyone would inevitably have some strange hallucinations in their mind, and the princess was no exception. Mr. Brando, who built these tunnels? Seeing the mysterious tunnel under Ampere's seal with her own eyes, Princess Griffin was still curious. As if to get rid of the faint uneasiness, she asked in a low voice. It should be the dwarves, but I don't know which one. Brando replied casually. It should be the ruined dwarves, my lord. The old witch Babasha replied from the front. So that's it. Brando didn't expect this to be another ruin of the ruined dwarves. However, there was almost no detail in the amber sword about the background of the tunnel here, and it seemed that the core key was still in the secret tunnel that the players had not discovered. After a short conversation, the surroundings quickly fell into silence again. The tunnel began to narrow, allowing only two people to walk side by side. Brando and Her Royal Highness had to get closer. The knight also noticed that the underground stairs had begun to seep, and the traces of artificial carvings had become very blurry from here on out. The surrounding stone walls were washed back to their original state by the underground water seeping down from above. After walking like this for about a quarter of an hour, the artificial tunnel completely disappeared, and a cliff appeared in front of them. A slanted crack cut off the tunnel, and when they raised the torch, they could see a natural stone wall that was as smooth as a mirror right in front of them. Brando motioned for Babasha to extinguish the torch, and then he took out a crystal for illumination. This crystal was basically the kind of cheap stuff that could be found everywhere, and the light it emitted was very dim. But it wasn't that Brando didn't have a better choice, but it was deliberate. He hadn't forgotten that below the cliff was the nest of the spider mother, and using a thermal light source would be like walking into a trap. After changing the light source, Brando blessed everyone with the Wings of the Wind spell. He was just a level 20 elementalist, and his Wings of the Wind was not enough to let people fly, but it was enough to use as a slow fall spell. The group slowly descended from the cliff, and it took a few minutes to reach the bottom. Below the cliff was a completely different scenery, and the knights soon discovered that there was an underground river below. The cobblestone beach on both sides of the river was covered with layers upon layers of white spider webs. Countless spider eggs could be seen clearly under the webs. One could even see fist-sized spiders crawling around in between the spider webs. Brendel subconsciously looked up and saw that the slanted cliff was covered with dense black meatball-like spiders. They were stacked layer upon layer, and the sight of them made his scalp tingle. He couldn't help but secretly curse. This was exactly the same as in the game. When they came here for an adventure, he subconsciously glanced above his head, and as a result, he was so scared that he screamed. At that time, the spider mother was lured out, and the result was that they were wiped out. He was once severely punished by his senior sister for this, and now he still blushed when he thought about it. But this was really too disgusting, a layer of dense floating worm wall above your head, and it felt like they would fall on your head at any time. Even if he was mentally prepared, he still felt a chill down his spine. Everyone listen, don't look above your head. Withdrawing his gaze, he immediately reminded them. The knight did as he said, but Princess Griffin was very sharp, and seemed to have guessed that there might be something above their heads. Brando felt that her face was a little pale, and several times she touched his hand with her hand, but immediately put it back. He didn't think that the princess would be so afraid of spiders. If he had known, maybe he would have let her look above her head, and maybe Princess Griffin would be so scared that she would hug him. Brando couldn't help but have such a wicked thought, but of course, it was just a thought. Mr. Brando, these spiders must have some origin. Princess Griffin asked with a pale face. She knew that it was impossible for so many spiders to inexplicably gather together, and the only possibility was that there was a monster's nest here. Brando nodded. It is said that the owner here is a spider mother called Anerons. That monster had the terrifying strength of elemental activation and even elemental enlightenment as early as 100 or 200 years ago. Legend has it that its elemental element is web, and a web means both binding and connecting. It can control every thread here. Right, don't touch those webs, not even a thread. Brando reminded. He was not here to clear the dungeon, and it was best not to provoke the terrifying spider mother if he could. Hearing what he said, everyone was stunned. But at this time, Brando heard a rustling sound coming from a direction. It didn't sound like the sound of a spider. He was slightly stunned and couldn't help but turn his head in that direction. P.S. It's still 4,000, the same old rule will be given to you at the end of the month. Please vote. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 626. Whether it was Woned or our world, there were more or less unnoticed corners on the battlefield since ancient times. It was like a blind spot forgotten by the eyes of the gods. No matter how fierce the battle there was, or what strange things happened, it was like a vacuum in the thinking range of the commanders on both sides of the war, and no one would take a second look at it. At the Half-a-Mealy fortress at the east gate of Ampere Seal, this fortress was built around 1,400 years of the Age of Chaos. It was an elf-style fortress, but since its birth, it seemed to have been blessed or cursed. Every war left it far behind. When Eric faced the barbarians, the lord of the Charmiman, Razor Sihad, let go of the open east 4 times and took a long detour to attack the south gate of Ampere Seal. Later, when fighting against Madara's first invasion in the Tide of Darkness, the Skeleton Lord once again let go of this ancient fortress. As a result, today, the princess's party and the northern nobles seem to have made an agreement that nothing would happen to Half-a-Mealy Fortress. After the demon invasion, the city was boiling, but the northeast corner was still dead silent. For a fortress built to deal with war, it was hard to say whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. But after 700 years of wind and rain, this fortress that had almost never experienced the flames of war was still a little old. Moss had also grown on the battlements, and the walls had become a kind of dark green that had a heavy sense of history in the wind and rain. The only difference between this fortress and other fortresses was that there was no trace of damage on the 300-meter-long section of the fortress, and there was no appearance of new and old parts being repaired. At this moment, there were no human soldiers in the fortress. Instead, there were hordes of harpies clamoring on the battlements or hovering in the heavy rain. However, the coast guards withdrew on their own, and Half-a-Mealy Fortress was lucky enough to miss the opportunity to fight. The harpies watched from the sky as a large pit with a diameter of hundreds of meters gradually formed below. Hundreds of cavemen were digging in this muddy pit rather than a construction site. Of course, you could say that they were struggling. Doing anything in this stormy weather was not a wise thing to do, and 2 of the worst were digging a pit and fighting a war. Although the troglodytes had built many shelves to stabilize the walls under the command of the sorcerers of Georgandy Ridge, collapses still occurred from time to time. Fortunately, the lives of the cavemen were insignificant. Lord Stark didn't care if 1, 100, or 1,000 cavemen died. It made no difference to him. The only difference was how much gold he had to spend. The cavemen were extremely fertile underground in Georgandy Ridge, and they could often exchange a small piece of land for an entire army. As long as he dug out that item within the time limit, he would be able to reap the rewards no matter how many losses he suffered. From time to time, there was a throbbing feeling coming from underground. Ordinary people often thought that it was a premonition before a bad omen, but wizards who were proficient in magic could tell that it was the ripples of dark magic flowing underground and eroding the lines of the world of order. Of course, for ordinary people, this was not a good thing, but for Stark, it was like a box of gold exuding a mellow smell like fine wine underground. No, not a box, but 100 boxes. According to the words of the demons from under the Sulphur River, 100 boxes of gold could not compare to the value of that thing. It was an existence that could not be measured by the foolish values of the mortal world. However, the demons abandoned the short-sightedness of mortals, and Stark also despised the values of demons. A treasure that could not be measured by gold. Wouldn't that be worthless? He shook his huge bull head and snorted at this. He, Stark, looked down on worthless things. But this time, he should have found the right place. Stark could smell the stench of the dark magic with his nose, and he couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. The cavemen under his command had given him a lot of trouble. In fact, until now, there had been continuous collapses under the pit. The subterranean dwellers had no choice but to transport more subterranean dwellers' corpses to prevent them from becoming part of the new landfill, just like what was happening now. Not long after, there was another commotion from below. What's wrong? Another collapse. Can't they just do their job properly? The tower and Lord Stark didn't take into account the fact that it never rained in Georgandy Ridge. He was only determined that if the cavemen gave him any more trouble, he would teach them a lesson. He would throw them into his favorite maze, the maze that Stark was most proud of. Even the smart and beautiful Medusa Lysimachia couldn't find the exit. But after coming out that time, Lysimachia immediately turned him into stone for 2 hours. She actually said that he was cheating and didn't build a door for the maze. But this was also a cunning strategy of the Taurans, wasn't it? Stark was deeply distressed that he couldn't win the favor of the beautiful lady. Why didn't anyone appreciate his wit? When he thought of Lysimachia, he couldn't help but think of that cold and beautiful face, so vivid that it seemed real. But Stark immediately realized that it was real, because he saw the beautiful Medusa coming out of the rain. So, what happened again? I heard the chaos below when I was up there. Lysimachia asked a little unhappily, did you grow such a big head to balance your body, Stark? Hearing Lysimachia's words, the Tauren Lord Stark showed a simple and honest smile. This expression, which could basically be described as a smirk, completely destroyed his fierce expression. Can you imagine a cow smirking like that? This was the face that Lady Medusa saw. She frowned. She could probably guess that this big fool wouldn't say anything even if she asked, so she simply pushed him aside with her hand and looked at the bottom of the pit herself. She immediately saw what seemed to be happening at the bottom of the pit. She saw a large group of cavemen screaming and scrambling up the slope at the bottom of the pit like rats in a pot. It felt like there was a cat at the bottom of the pot in addition to the rats. What are you doing? Lysimachia was almost mad with anger. If she didn't still have a trace of reason left, she would have turned back and glared fiercely at that bastard Stark, turning him into a stone statue forever. That stone statue must be as mighty as the legendary Tauren Lord Minotaurs, and no one would know how stupid this guy was from then on. That was the most important thing. But unfortunately, the caveman couldn't answer her. What are you doing? When we heard this shrill cry that was not one bit inferior to a siren's piercing scream piercing through the curtain of rain, our merchant lady turned into a black cat with the help of the white mist. A cloud of dense black smoke rose up, and a kitten with shiny black fur and golden pupils walked out of the smoke with small cat-like steps. She seemed to be very curious about this form, but for a witch, turning into a magic animal was actually a professional spell. The white mist didn't tell her, she would soon get used to it all. The white mist watched the Roman curiously licking his left paw, then looking at his right paw, stretching out his paw to scratch his ear, and then wagging his tail. She couldn't stand it anymore, so she turned into a circle of white mist and surrounded her. Her left paw turned into a white butterfly knot and tied it behind the merchant lady's neck. Let's go, it seems to be very chaotic down there. Now is a good time, the white mist said in her usual feeble tone. The Roman then walked out of the grass and quietly came to the edge of the pit. The bottom of the pit was a mess, and it was unknown whether there had been a larger collapse or something, but the cavemen were screaming and fleeing upward. There was no brotherhood between these creatures from the underground of Jorgendy Ridge. They fought each other just to be one step ahead. If possible, they could leave their companions behind. In her fury, Lysimachia turned several cavemen who rushed up to the pit into stone, but she didn't get any answers. At this time, naturally, no one paid attention to the movement at the edge of the pit, or rather, no one saw a cat at the edge of the pit. Of course, in fact, only Stark and Lysimachia had eyes that could see. The Roman stepped lightly on the scaffolding and jumped all the way to the bottom of the pit, like a real kitten. The white mist sighed and felt that the merchant lady might as well have been a cat. But she suddenly felt that compared to the Roman's curiosity, perhaps a cat with 9 lives was her true home. If there was reincarnation in the world of Woned, the white mist might think that the Roman had reincarnated in the wrong body. But while she was distracted, the merchant lady had already dodged left and right, avoiding several groups of cavemen. She dexterously landed on a reinforced board and stared at the bottom of the pit with her golden eyes wide open. White mist, look, what is that? White mist looked down and immediately saw a dozen strange creatures chasing the cavemen in front of them. The reason why she said they were strange creatures was that they looked a little like spiders, but in her extensive knowledge, there was absolutely no spider wrapped in sharp crystals. If she hadn't seen the exposed limbs, she would have thought that it was a few huge crystals chasing and hunting below. Ah, it's a crystal cluster, she cried out. A crystal cluster, what is that? the Roman asked curiously. At this time, a few crystal clusters were close to the surface. They were very fierce and bloodthirsty. Many subterranean dwellers died under their claws and fangs. But what was creepy was that they didn't kill the subterranean dwellers for the sake of hunting. They simply killed the subterranean dwellers and tossed their corpses aside as if they had undergone professional training or had experienced it thousands of times. On the ground, Medusa Lysimachia finally noticed these uninvited guests. "Are they guards?" she muttered and threw away the lucky caveman in her hand, throwing it into the pit. She took a short bow from her waist and aimed at the crystal clusters. One arrow at a time, she shot the first two back. The few crystal clusters displayed a very powerful combat strength, which was about the level of beginner gold. The cavemen were no match for them at all. Lysimachia tested them and realized that she had encountered a difficult opponent. A crystal cluster is a crystal cluster. Let's go down and take a look. At the bottom of the pit, White Mist was answering the Roman's doubts in her unique way. "Will they kill the Roman?" the Roman asked a little nervously. "No, I'm here." White Mist replied simply. The merchant lady nodded and jumped down, landing steadily on the other side of the pit. Only then did the two realize how deep the bottom of the pit was. The bottom of the pit had been dug through, and artificial traces began to appear below. It should be a ruin, with many holes leading to the dark underground. The two casually found an entrance and went in. At this moment, there were no cavemen in the ruins, and no new crystal clusters appeared. Other than the sound of rain and water, it seemed a little lonely. In fact, after entering the depths of the ruins, the sound of rain gradually faded, and the outline of a huge existence gradually emerged in the darkness. "Ah!" Bai Wu let out another cry of surprise. "What's wrong?" The Roman hurriedly jumped forward and looked up curiously. She saw the huge outline gradually become clearer in her field of vision, and then outlined the shape of a head. To be exact, it should be part of a huge stone statue. Or according to the Romans' understanding, it was a little like the marble statues used to decorate castle abbeys after being magnified 1,000 times. However, the stone statue's facial lines were very strong, and it did not look like a modern human. It was more like a sculpture made for a race other than humans. However, the Roman looked at it and saw that it had neither a beard nor pointed ears. "It's not a dwarf, nor an elf," she commented with some insight. "What is this, White Mist?" "The Titan Colossus. I didn't expect it to be here. I didn't expect it to be here." White Mist muttered to herself. If she could widen her eyes, the listless woman would definitely widen her eyes to the maximum at this moment. Brando listened attentively, and the rustling sound in the darkness was getting closer and closer. But it was definitely not the sound made by the broodmother. It would not make such a loud noise. Although the broodmother was a huge creature, its movements were very light, and it was a lurking hunter. Thinking back to the experience of the exploration, Brando still remembered it clearly. Everyone stopped. The knight all put their hands on their swords, but they did not draw their swords. This was also a skill they learned from Brando. Sometimes, drawing the sword first did not give them the upper hand, but instead exposed their position to the opponent, especially when facing an unknown enemy. Brando was very satisfied with the others' actions. He was the first to see the uninvited guests that suddenly appeared. The first thing that appeared in the darkness was a floating glimmer, as if it was refracting the dim light of the illuminating crystal in his hand. Then he saw what it was, a creature made of crystal, and from the shape, it should be a spider. But they were no longer spiders. Crystal cluster. Brando was slightly startled. How could there be such a thing here? This instant should not have such a monster, not to mention that there was a reason for any kind of monster to appear in a certain place. Just like the group of wind elementals under the Mar Highlands, they would never drop by for no reason. Crystal cluster monsters were very special. Brando had only seen them in a few places, and each time there were not many of them. Many thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. But his reaction was very fast. He lowered his center of gravity, and the Halran Gaia was already in his hand. "Prepare for battle," Her Royal Highness shouted in a low voice behind him. The knight drew their swords in unison. P.S. Crying and angrily begging for votes. All kinds of votes. Wait, forget about the subpoena. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 627. When the knight heard the princess' order, they all pulled out their long swords and lined up in a line to fight the enemy. The witches stood together with Brendel, and the two sides were clearly divided. The large crystallized saber-toothed spiders were in front of them in the blink of an eye, but to everyone's surprise, these horrifying monsters acted as if they didn't see them. They separated to the sides, bypassed them, and went straight into the darkness on the other side. What's going on? Everyone turned their heads and saw these crystallized monsters rushing forward without stopping, disappearing at the end of the darkness on the other side. Soon, there was only the sound of distant spiders. Not to mention the knight, even Brando and the witches around him couldn't help but be puzzled by this scene. If something was out of the ordinary, it must be a demon. Most of the demons were cruel and bloodthirsty, so there must be a reason behind their strange behavior. They seemed to be running away. Behind Brando, Princess Griffin whispered with uncertainty. Yes, they are running away. As if a flash of lightning flashed through his mind, Brando reacted. His expression changed. Each of those large crystallized saber-toothed spiders was not inferior to a human swordsman who had entered the Gold Realm. What else could make them run for their lives underground? The answer was quite obvious. Put away your swords and run, something is chasing them from behind. When Brando thought of the horror of the female spider, he couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle. He suddenly felt that he was in conflict with this place. Every time he came here, he would encounter all kinds of situations. The knight was slightly startled, and then they reacted. Their expressions changed as they put away their long swords and turned to retreat. Brando was afraid. They ran into Anaron's spider web in a panic and hurriedly reminded everyone to point out the way. There were layers of spider silk everywhere underground, and it seemed that it was safest to go along the river bank. But only Brando knew that it was actually a trap. The real safe road was on the side of the cliff. He only had a safe narrow passage to pass through the cliff. In fact, there was a treasure there, but Brando was not in the mood to think about it at the moment. He led everyone through the rocky stalactites, avoiding the huge spider webs that connected almost the entire underground passage. Not long after, everyone heard a rustling sound behind them. It was like a big hand rubbing yarn. Princess Griffin subconsciously looked back and suddenly saw 4 pairs of scarlet eyes in the darkness, each the size of a fist. She was so frightened that she couldn't help but let out a low cry. Her legs went soft and she almost fell. Brando was quick and hurriedly grabbed her. Don't look back, she's looking for us. Is that the Spider Mother? Her Royal Highness finally calmed down the fear in her heart and asked in a low voice. Yes, that's her. Brendel nodded his head calmly. He didn't need to look back at all to know that the spider was following behind them. Dark perception was a powerful attribute in the Amber Sword. Now that it was showing its power again, Brando could clearly feel the chill on his back. However, that kind of feeling wouldn't be too comfortable. She didn't see us. She's determining our position. He wanted to tell the princess that the spider's eyes were ornaments or used to scare people. Although there were a lot of them, her real eyes were the silk under her feet. She sensed the position of her prey through vibration. Her silk was all over the underground passage, and the slightest vibration would attract her attention. The group of people and the spider, one running and one chasing, quickly passed through a large cave filled with spider webs. Brando specifically chose the relatively narrow caves to drill in and out, which greatly limited the speed of the spider, but even so, the huge monster had been closely following them. The nights were fine. High-intensity training allowed them to easily cope with this kind of situation. Even if they wore heavy armor, they could keep up with Brando's pace. However, the witches, who lacked exercise on weekdays, soon couldn't hold on. Several old witches followed behind, and Brando had to slow down to ensure that no one was left behind. The broodmother was one step closer to them, and Brendel could almost feel every step she took with every step she took. He couldn't help but feel anxious. At this time, he was actually very close to the narrow opening in his impression. He just had to hold on for a little longer. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The spider mother, Anerons, seemed to realize that something was wrong. She suddenly let out a scream and chased after them. She raised her colisary high and swept towards Brando and the others. Right in front. Brando shouted in his heart and rolled forward with Her Royal Highness in his arms. The princess groaned, and the spider mother, Aneron's giant colisary swept over the top of their heads. Two knight and a witch who couldn't dodge in time were directly cut in half. The broken human body fell to the ground like two pieces of wood, and then blood gushed out like a blood fountain, sprinkling all over the nearby ground. Brando vaguely heard the voice of the little witch called a sugar pot and screamed in fright. He grabbed Halran Gaia and got up from the ground in a daze. He looked up and saw another cliff in front of him. However, on the side of the cliff, there was a crack that was half a person wide. The rocks in the crack were intertwined, and it was pitch black. It was exactly the same as in his memory. This was the place he was looking for. Everyone, don't stop, go inside. Brando didn't dare to neglect and immediately shouted to the others. The knight and witches heard him and ran in that direction. He looked back again and only saw the spider mother, Anerons, in the darkness once again raised her colisary. 4 pairs of blood-red eyes stared at him condescendingly. Who is afraid of you, monster? Brando had no room to retreat at this moment. He simply stood up straight, raised Halran Gaia, and took a step forward. The dark blade swung in mid-air and slashed towards the spider mother, Aneron's colisary. With a loud bang, Brando only felt that he had cut a steel pillar or a rock. A dazzling spark suddenly burst out in the darkness. Half of his body was numb, and he only felt a huge force directly take him out and hit the rock wall on the side. Brando raised his head and suddenly groaned. The Halran Gaia in his hand also flew out of his hand. It spun and bounced off a few stalactite pillars, making a series of tinkling sounds in the darkness, and then fell into a ball of spider web. It hurts. Brando realized how far he was from the real elemental enlightenment. The battle with Williams had made him a little too hot-headed, and the after-effects only appeared at this moment. After all, the power of a planeswalker was not his own power. He felt a burst of bitterness in his throat, and his mouth was full of a salty taste. However, this was not the time to think about the gains and losses. He shook his head hard to get rid of the dizziness, but his head was also injured. He barely lifted his blood-covered eyelids and saw the broodmother, Anerons, swinging her 8 legs getting closer and closer to him in a scarlet scene. Brando felt his heart tighten at that moment. The knight and the witches had already approached the crack at this time, and only then did they find that Brando had been sent flying. They wanted to turn back to rescue, but it seemed that it was too late now. It was at this time that Princess Griffine, who was not far away, suddenly reacted and rushed to the knight who had been killed before. She picked up his relics, a long sword, and then threw it at the spider mother with all her strength. The bright blade spun and hit the spider mother's head, hitting her small head to the side. The half-fairy princess then pulled out her sword, and shouted to the huge spider with a pale face, monster, I'm here." "No, Your Highness." Brando coughed and cried anxiously. But Her Highness had already held the sword with both hands and was getting closer and closer to the Spider Mother. Although the Spider Mother, Anerons, had awakened the elements and entered the field of elemental truth, it was not an intelligent creature after all. The awakening of the law was just an instinct. The approach of Princess Griffin made it feel threatened. It turned to the half-fairy princess with some confusion, and then raised its colisary high, ready to teach this insignificant little thing that dared to challenge it. Brando's blood coagulated, and he immediately took out a bottle of holy water and drank it. Then he rolled forward to the pile of spider webs, and pulled out the Halran Gaia from it. But at this time, the Spider Mother had already launched an attack on Princess Griffin. The half-elf girl carefully took a step back. Facing this terrible monster, her hands were almost trembling as she clenched the long sword, but she still gritted her teeth and assumed the posture of Erwin's military swordsmanship. If Brando were to evaluate her posture, he was afraid that it was completely in line with the standard, almost perfect, but meaningless. The princess' sword-holding posture showed that she had put a lot of effort into swordsmanship. Just this meticulous starting posture alone was enough to make people's eyes light up and get 3 points in advance in a knight's arena. Unfortunately, this was not a knight's arena. It was a battlefield where they fought each other. In the face of a monster, no one would follow the rules of a knight. Monsters would not, and swordsmen would not. Princess Griffin had done her best. She gritted her teeth and held the colisary of the Spider Mother, Anerons, but the huge force still pressed her to the ground with a whimper. Then the second colisary went from top to bottom and pierced the princess's head. "Be careful." Brando's hands and feet were cold, afraid to see the scene of Princess Griffin being killed in front of him. But it was at this time that a white light lit up from Her Highness, and suddenly the Spider Mother's huge colisary moved to one side and pierced the girl's left shoulder. Although the half-elf girl clenched her teeth, she still let out a scream after suppressing it. She had never felt such intense pain since she was a child, and tears couldn't help but burst out of her eyes. Defensive equipment. Brando's heart dropped. Fortunately, he didn't have a heart attack, otherwise, he would be scared to death. However, he couldn't help but secretly wipe his sweat. He should have thought that Princess Griffin, as a member of the royal family, would definitely have 1 or 2 life-saving magic equipment. In an instant, it was the difference between life and death. Brando finally arrived. He roared, raised Halran Gaia and slashed at the junction between the Spider Mother's huge body and small head. But the expected scene was just an imagination. The invincible blade of Halran Gaia only drew a bright spark on the hard shell of Anerons. Brando couldn't help but feel a little hopeless. Is this thing so hard? Brando's attack still attracted the attention of the Spider Mother. It pulled out the colisary on Princess Griffin's left shoulder, turned its head, waved its right claw, and hit Brando's chest. The attack was so fast that Brendel did not even have time to react before he was swept to the ground, and he felt dizzy from the fall. He shook his head and wanted to get up again, but he felt that Anerons raised its front foot and pressed on his shoulders. Then the huge spider lowered its body, opened its colisary, and revealed 8 pairs of sharp fangs under its scarlet eyes. F***ck, this guy can't be hungry, right? Brando's eyes widened, and he was so scared that his heart was about to jump out. After all, no one would feel good to be the next meal of a behemoth. His mind was spinning fast, and he was thinking of a way to escape. At this time, Her Highness pressed on her shoulder and rushed up. She raised her sword and hit Aneron's head with her sword. The brood mother was about to bite down on Brendel, but she was knocked into the rock instead. The wound on Princess Griffin's shoulder was torn open again because of this, and Anerons also bit a big hole on the hard granite ground in the cave, leaving a pool of highly corrosive venom. Her Highness the Princess groaned in pain, and the Spider Mother couldn't help but scream angrily. She immediately turned her head and sprayed a dark green poison arrow at Princess Griffin. Her Highness the Princess was holding the long sword with her hand against the Spider Mother's commissary. She couldn't avoid it, and the magic equipment on her body had lost its effect. She could only close her eyes and turn her head away. However, the poison arrow did not fall on her as she imagined. Princess Griffin shrank her neck and waited for a moment, then she opened her eyes slightly. She looked back and was surprised to see a light blue shield appear beside her, and the poison arrow had already disappeared. This was Water Shield, a spell that even elemental apprentices could use, but it was the biggest nemesis of Anaron's poison arrow. This was the valuable experience of the players and Brando's greatest wealth. After the Spider Mother sprayed poison twice in a row, she couldn't help but fall into dispirited state. Brando, who finally got a chance to breathe, quickly shouted, "Babasha, find a way to help." In fact, he wanted to break free by himself, but unfortunately, the Spider Mother was not on the same level as him. Even in a dispirited state, he couldn't deal with her. Previously, he was lucky to use the magic breaker all to pierce the other party's line of law, causing the other party's law to backfire and kill the other party. But it was also the guy's fault for being stupid enough to pull him into the extreme plane. The Spider Mother was completely different. Even if he had a way to take out the god-slaying magic breaker all now, he also needed the other party to have the line of law to nail him. Most of the monsters were very sensitive, and they wouldn't easily use their power of law. But Babasha really found a way at this moment. The wrinkled old witch immediately said to her adopted daughter, "Quick, Sugar Jar, use your spell." The girl holding the honey jar climbed out of the crack, and then Brando saw many inexplicable creatures emerging behind her. Some looked like cows or horses, some looked like monsters or legendary creatures, and some didn't have a specific image at all. Each creature had its own name. Brando recognized at a glance that those were real names, the names with real power engraved on the codex. Most of those names were strange and written in a variety of languages. Some were even pure strings of letters, or things with unknown meanings. In this world, only one kind of existence would use such a name. That was the contract spirit. Contract spirit. It turned out that this little girl was a spirit contract master, a branch of witches specializing in psychic magic. Brando vaguely remembered that it should be the witches guarding the entrance to the undead kingdom in the Silent Land, the inheritance of the witches of life and death. So it was them. He widened his eyes and looked at Sugar Jar. "Beings of this world who have signed a pure contract with Sugar Jar, please bestow your power upon me." Then a pure black creature flew out from behind her and landed on the Broodmother's body. Then Brando felt the Broodmother's forelimbs on his body loosen. He looked back and found that the terrible creature had fallen asleep. Thoreau, the god of sleep. Brando then realized what the contract spirit summoned by Sugar Jar was. Although Thoreau was a contract spirit, he was actually considered a lesser god. There weren't many witches who could summon such a powerful contract spirit, especially Sugar Jar, who only had the strength of a silver rank. He immediately suspected the identity of the other party. Could this girl be a direct descendant of the witches of life and death? "Hurry up, my lord." Babasha hurriedly ran over to support Sugar Jar. The girl fainted from exhaustion after casting the spell. Sugar Jar's spell has a big flaw. "I don't know how long this thing can sleep." Brando was shocked. He hurriedly crawled out from under the sleeping Broodmother and helped the similarly dispirited princess up. Then he quickly ran towards the knight. Unfortunately, before he could run 2 steps, he heard an angry roar behind him. Then a strong wind hit him. F***ck, this spell's duration is too short. Brando suddenly wailed in his heart. When Babasha said that Sugar Jar's spell had a flaw, he didn't feel it, but now he finally knew what it meant. But this flaw was too much of a scam. P.S. I'm a bit jammed. But after slowly writing, I found that I actually wrote 5,000 words. So I asked for votes. Sob sob, my performance this month wasn't bad. Asking for votes shouldn't be a problem, right? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidyan. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 628. Mother of Spiders ejected her commissary from the inside out and swept towards Brando's back. Like a sharp scimitar, it caused the air to vibrate as it waved, forming a transparent belt of light in the dark underground. Brando heard a scream similar to an explosion, and the scream seemed to have reached his back as soon as it came out. This was the power from the most powerful creature. At that moment, several attack patterns of Anaron's front commissary emerged in Brando's mind one by one. At that critical moment, he pushed Her Royal Highness forward and put Halran Gaia on his back. There was a loud bang that made one's teeth ache. Although Brando couldn't see it, he could feel the scene of Halran Gaia's body bending due to excessive force. The unresolvable force was transmitted to him through it, and he felt a huge force coming from behind and sending him flying. The distance between the cliff in front of him and him seemed to be pulled closer. But Brando knew that it was an illusion, and that he was flying over the cliff and over the abyss. Fortunately, the will attribute strengthened the nerve's endurance, otherwise, he would have triggered his body's protective mechanism and fainted from the pain. Brando didn't want to fall into the abyss when he lost consciousness. He shot forward like a cannonball, his body tumbling in mid-air, although the pain was like a file rubbing against his nerves. But he still gritted his teeth and inserted Halran Gaia into the ground of the cave. With the strength of elemental awakening, Halran Gaia's blade directly pierced more than a foot into the rock, and a golden spark immediately appeared in the darkness. Brando's momentum was reduced, but the Halran Gaia in his hand still cut through the entire cliff like cutting tofu. While drawing a deep incision on the ground, he still stubbornly approached the edge of the cliff. All this happened in less than a tenth of the blink of an eye. As if the last breath was not over, Brando had already flown out of the cliff. He brought out a large piece of rock with him, and his momentum finally came to a stop. Brando somersaulted in the air and raised his right hand with the ring of the Wind Empress. He fired a wind bullet at the cliff on the other side. The airflow converged on Brando's ring in an instant, and then it slammed into the rock on the other side. The huge gray rock was smashed into pieces, and the huge reaction force finally made Brando stop in the air. He raised his head. The sound of the wind above his head brought another sharp whistle. That was the Mother of Spiders' right front commissary. After her left limb swept out, the remaining 6 legs supported her huge body. She raised her right limb and immediately stabbed towards Brando, who was in midair. In the eyes of outsiders, even the silver-ranked knight, the 2 attacks seemed to have happened at the same time. However, only Brando knew that it was actually one from the front and one from the back. This was the cunning creature's most common attack. If the first strike didn't kill the target, then the second strike would be perfect. But this time, no one came to distract him. Brando stared at the sickle-like claw that was getting closer and closer in his vision. But he knew that this was actually futile. The speed was too fast, even exceeding his level of in-depth analysis. What really worked was the dark perception attribute he obtained from Firefly. The magic flowing in Anaron's body was like a spark in the darkness. It came close to him in an instant. This was the moment. Brando only had this one chance. He reached out and grabbed the sharp tip of the Mother of Spiders' right front commissary, and then his whole body was dragged back. At that moment, time seemed to slow down in his perception. He saw himself being dragged back into the cliff by the other's retracted commissary, and then approaching the rock wall in a beautiful arc. He could almost see the crack that was getting closer and closer, and the faces of the knight. They seemed to have just reacted, and didn't even have time to exclaim. Brando only saw some of them with their mouths wide open. Then he calculated the distance, released his hand, and the crack was in front of him. It was a perfect landing. His tense nerves relaxed. Then, like a cannonball, he flew in a beautiful arc and crashed into the rock wall with a bang. Damn it, aw. Brando let out an extremely painful scream. It was as if he never dreamed that he would make a mistake at the last moment. In any case, this mistake was enough for him to remember. The rock underground was really hard, and it was really scary. But he didn't have time to be upset, and immediately shouted desperately, "Drag me in." Fortunately, the others didn't notice the young lord's little mistake. After all, it was already a great thing to be able to escape from the mouth of the terrible monster. The knights of Lantanerin seemed to wake up from a dream, and the 3 knights standing at the front of the crack immediately rushed out and dragged him back. Brando was not far away at that time, and it was only a difference of 1 or 2 meters. The knights stretched out half of their bodies and dragged him back. On the other side, Her Royal Highness had been pushed to Babash's feet by Brando. The old witch hurriedly helped her and Sugarpot into the crack. It had to be said that the old witch looked dry and thin, but she still had some strength. "Thank you," Griffin replied weakly. Her shoulder was a shocking blood red, and the large amount of blood loss made her already pale face even paler. But until this time, she still managed to show the proper etiquette of a nobleman, or the arrogance of a nobleman. Brando or others may find it difficult to understand what a noble who valued face more than life was made of, but for a princess who had been taught such a lesson since childhood, some values were natural. But for the elder princess, perhaps there was one more thing to add, and that was her stubbornness. When the princess saw Brando lying on the ground covered in blood, she was shocked and asked in a low voice, "Mr. Brando?" "I'm fine." Brando did not lie. In fact, most of the injuries on his body were scrapes from hitting the rock wall head-on at the end. He just looked like a mess. Compared to him, Princess Griffin's injuries were much more serious. But Brando did not have time to talk nonsense, because Mother of Spiders poked her head into the crack again, trying to reach in with 2 front claws to drag them out. Everyone was shocked and hurriedly retreated back into the crevice. Mother of Spiders was only a step away from the knight outside. She could not help but scream angrily. The sound was sharp and harsh, like a sharp weapon cutting through glass. It was really creepy. But only Brando knew that Mother of Spiders would never be able to come in here, but it was not safe here. He ordered, "Don't stop, keep retreating. There are many of her children here. She will find a way to let them come in and kill us." Everyone was already frightened by Anarthan. When they heard that there were small spiders, they did not dare to stop and hurriedly continued to move deeper into the crack. Brando was helped forward by a knight. After resting for a while, he finally caught his breath. He then took out the holy water and distributed it to the injured knights and Her Royal Highness. The power of the holy water was naturally needless to say. After a while, everyone looked at him with a little curiosity mixed with awe. In their eyes, Brendel was a young lord who could do anything, and there was nothing he couldn't do. Not only could he defeat the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but he could also escape from the terrible monsters. He seemed to have endless treasures on him, and there was no situation that could baffle him. Such a person might not even exist in long poems and legends. Even the knights could not help but privately think that if today's story were to spread, it might be a legendary ballad that circulated in the bars of Erewhon and even Woned. After Her Royal Highness drank a bottle of No. 7 holy water, she held the bottle with both hands and was in a daze for a while. She looked at Brando with a puzzled look. Holy water was different from ordinary magic items because it often required both alchemy and high-level priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to make it. Brando actually had so much holy water. Although she only saw a few bottles, this amount was enough. What's more, Brando gave the holy water to the knight, and she did not see any distress on his face. This meant that he must have more holy water in his hands. Although Griffin did not covet the holy water, this did not stop her from becoming more and more curious about Brando's experience. She wanted to know more about what secrets this man was hiding, just as she had always wanted to confirm his identity and purpose in her heart. The half-elf girl acquiesced to Brando becoming her knight, but everyone knew that this identity was somewhat unworthy of the title. Even the princess herself felt that there were too many things about him that could not be explained. Their relationship was not like a knight and a princess, but more like a relationship of equals. She had to accept his help. This relationship had once made her feel uneasy, and she had always vaguely wanted to change this relationship. But it was all in vain. She did not know if Brando could understand her kindness and her intention to seek change, but at the moment when Brando was in danger, she suddenly understood that she would not allow him to die like this. She had tasted the taste of loneliness for too long. Even her teacher, the Wolf Knight, could not fully understand her thoughts. Although Benninger's disguise was almost perfect, he was only someone who could help her. Her Royal Highness suddenly felt a little moved. Her heart tightened, and she quickly frowned. She hurriedly collected her thoughts and returned to her original calmness. Because she knew that it was impossible. She had to be careful. This was already the limit. After entering the crack, the group had gone deep into the underground of Ampere Seal. The temperature rose a little. At first, it only offset the cold outside, but gradually it became a little hot. Especially since there was no wind flowing underground, the air was full of a stale smell. Brando was talking to Babasha. Babasha, where is the secret passage you know? It's not far north from here. I know where there should be a secret door. So it's on the way. Brando's eyes lit up. This was good news. He was afraid that the secret passage would be in the ruins hall in the east, or in the ancient underground tunnel further east. Not to mention whether he could remember the maze-like terrain after so long, the key point was that it was also the territory of the mother of spiders, Anaron. He did not want to provoke that female tiger and then find trouble with her. That was really a female tiger. Babasha looked at him mysteriously and did not speak. It was as if the rumor that the darkness dragon knew everything had been deeply rooted in people's hearts. My lord obviously knew all this long ago. She undoubtedly thought so. The prophecy of the word of darkness was simply accurate, and feudal superstition was deeply engraved in her mind. But it was at this time that Brando, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stopped and then reached out to stop everyone behind him. Everyone was slightly startled because they did not feel anything unusual at all. But after coming here and experiencing several battles, everyone had a tacit understanding, and no one questioned easily. A moment later, they saw a few black shadows emerging from a crack not far away. The knight looked at each other. Meeting other, humanoid creatures in this dangerous underground was obviously a little beyond their expectations. But only Brando saw it clearly. It was a caveman. He made a silent gesture. The caveman's hearing was surprisingly sensitive, especially in the silence where most of the sound could only travel in one direction underground. Fortunately, after reaching elemental awakening, his 5 senses were 100 times sharper than ordinary people. Otherwise, he would have been discovered by the other party first. Except for the clans led by ABs who left the underground world and fled to the surface, there were very few cavemen who wandered outside of the underground lords. But one was already very rare. Brando didn't think he was lucky enough to encounter such things one after another. There was only one possibility for the other party's identity, that was, they were part of the underground army of Georgandy Ridge. But how did they get here? Did the other party also discover this secret passage? Brando didn't think this was likely. Could it be that there was a passage connected to the underground of Georgandy Ridge nearby? That was very likely. He couldn't help but frown as he watched the subterranean dwellers slowly crawl into another crack. The underground world extended in all directions, but most of the naturally formed passages led to dead ends. Some of them also led to the lairs of monsters or traps. But Brando remembered that the path should lead to the ancient ruins hall. The other party did not seem to have discovered the secret door that Baba Shah was talking about. He breathed a sigh of relief. When the cavemen were far away, the knight asked, "My lord, they?" These Lantern Island knight had previously addressed Brando as Sir, but now they directly addressed Brando as my lord. But Brando probably didn't know that the change in the details of this address was not only because the other party was in awe of his strength, but also because Eco had been telling his deeds in the Eversong forest to his knight all year round. These knights may have originally scoffed at their successor who was full of knight ideals, but now it seemed that even Eco's position in their hearts had risen a lot. It was a pity that Brando didn't know the details of this, otherwise he would have been ashamed. He waited for a while before replying in a low voice, "The cavemen know the underground world far better than we do. It's not surprising that they can find this place. This doesn't mean anything. Let's move on first." Everyone nodded, as though they were going to do whatever Brendel said. But in fact, Brando himself didn't have much confidence in his heart. He only hoped that the old witch Baba Shah wasn't lying to him. Hopefully that secret passage was as hidden as she said, or else this would be a waste of effort. And getting out would be a problem. He couldn't help but glance at Baba Shah. Unfortunately, the old witch's face was hidden under the hood and he couldn't see anything, but she didn't look nervous. P.S. I had something to do today and it was already 8:00 when I came back. I was a little tired and didn't want to write, but I thought it was better not to break it, so I wrote a chapter. Sorry to keep you waiting. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 629. Even though he was curious as to why the subterranean dwellers would appear in these underground ruins, he calmly buried his curiosity. He silently glanced at the direction where the subterranean dwellers had left. It was inevitable that he would maliciously speculate whether or not they would be torn to pieces by the enraged mother of spiders. But that was all he could do. Then, he calmed himself down and turned around to signal the others to continue moving forward. Considering the possibility of encountering more enemies, no one spoke again, and instead lowered the sound of footsteps. The rustling sound passed through the dark underground, and the surroundings returned to a quiet peace. But that was just a facade. Everyone knew that there was danger lurking under the surface. Although the knights were not familiar with the creatures that came from the dark underground, they had at least heard that they had extraordinary hearing. No one wanted to cause trouble at this time. The cracks in the rock walls began to narrow, but gradually, sections of artificial tunnels appeared. Ancient ruins appeared frequently during this part of the journey, giving the impression that these ruins were mixed among the natural rock walls. Earthquakes would often cause such a phenomenon, but in the world of magic, powerful magic could also cause the same phenomenon. I don't need to guess all of this myself, because the players have already discussed it before. Brendel carefully observed the surroundings that were quietly soaked in darkness. He did not need to guess all of this because the players in the past had already discussed this. In fact, there were players who were obsessed with exploring the history and background of the game, and they tirelessly unearthed the other side of the game's cold rules, looking for the details of the game's planners. They did have a lot of achievements, and The Amber Sword was undoubtedly an excellent game. It had countless history and details, and was so complex that it was hard to believe it was really a game. Those histories strictly followed the laws of history, and suddenly reached a perfect self-consistency. Players rarely found loopholes, and it was just like a real world. Brando himself had read a lot of such literature, but he was not the so-called story fan, nor was he a fan of the background. He simply felt that some of the missions in the game involved the ancient times and the background, and the more he knew, the better he could achieve his goals in the game. He felt that he was a middle-of-the-road player, but it seemed that because of this, he had never been a top player. even though he had invested far more time than the others. However, ever since he had transmigrated to this world, his experience and knowledge, whether it was in the game or in the background, had given him an amazing advantage. He led the team through the broken tunnel for more than 10 minutes, and then Babasha stopped at a place. Before that, Brando felt that they had entered a small hall, which was completely made of green granite. This feature was very obvious in the game, and it was because of this that he found the name of this place in his hazy memory, Lotholm's Temple of Meditation. The reason why it was said to be vague was because in the game, this place did not occupy a very conspicuous position in this dungeon. This place was supposed to be a side hall in the underground ruins, a place for its residents to meditate and pray. In fact, there was a fountain on one side of the granite hall. There was a statue of God on the fountain, but unfortunately, it had long collapsed, so it was impossible to tell which god it was. Brando subconsciously looked in that direction, and sure enough, he saw the fountain in his memory, but the spring water had dried up, leaving only stair-like troughs. This was supposed to be a temporary resting place for players in the Amber Sword, because in the game, large dungeons like this were generally not large in scale, and players may have to stay in the dungeon for a few days or even longer, so the designers had to design some places for them to go offline and rest. The underground ruins of Ampere Seal were divided into two parts. The upper level was the ancient temple, and the lower level was the lair of the Mother of Spiders. The size of this dungeon was not the largest that Brando had ever seen, so it only had two resting places, one in the north, in the direction of the Shalek Mountains, and the other was this. Because of this, Brando could barely remember the name of this resting place. If it were the large, super-large ruins in the later stages of the game, there would be hundreds of resting places in a dungeon, and it would be strange if he could remember the name of such an ordinary resting place. However, this temple had long been studied by the pioneers, and every inch of its ground had been imprinted with the footprints of players. Witches, Black Tower mages, astrologists, and even dwarven rune mages, all professions related to the background had been repeatedly tested here, and there could be no more secrets here. So Brando couldn't help but look at the old witch Babasha curiously, wanting to see what tricks she could come up with. A secret that the players in the Land of Order had yet to discover. Just this title alone would be an explosive piece of news in his previous world. Then he saw Babasha walking towards the fountain, and couldn't help but frown. As the only conspicuous and iconic decoration of this sanctum of meditation, it naturally received the most attention from the players. The players even tore down the fountain and broke through the wall behind it, but to no avail. Is there something here? Out of curiosity, he couldn't help but ask. But there shouldn't be any traps here, just an ordinary wall. My lord has a keen eye. If he didn't know the meaning of Babasha's words, Brando would probably think it was a disgusting flattery. However, many of the Lantern Island Knights' faces inevitably showed a displeased look, and Her Royal Highness also frowned, but more than half of her frown was out of doubt. As Babasha said so, she had already walked to the fountain. She explained respectfully, "My lord, you're right. There are indeed no traps behind the wall here, and there are no secret passages behind it. But for us witches, the pool itself is a record of something. Oh. My lord must be very clear that before the statue on the pool was damaged, it was the holy statue of the darkness dragon Odin. This place has a lot to do with us witches, but not every branch of witches has the ability to unravel the secrets of this place," Babasha replied mysteriously. Brendel furrowed his brows when he heard her mention the Dragon of Darkness. However, there was a discussion on the forum, and one of the possibilities mentioned that this statue may have come from before the War of the Holy Saints. Although there wasn't much history before that, the Darkness Dragon once ruled the land, so it wasn't surprising that there was a statue of him here. He nodded and heard Babasha mention that not every witch has the ability to unlock the secrets here. He subconsciously turned his gaze to the lishless sugar pot. Since the little witch cast the spell, she had always looked weak, as if she didn't even have the strength to move a finger. It was said that she would continue to look like this for a while, and she could only cast a spirit contract spell like the one just now once a day. However, the reason why Brando looked at her was because he had always been suspicious. He suspected that Sugarpot was the purest descendant of the witches of life and death. As everyone knew, each of the 12 witches had only one descendant with the purest bloodline. For example, the inheritance of the Witch Queen was now with the Roman people, and he had once suspected that the Roman Aunt Jenny, was the inheritor of the eternal witches. Babasha saw his eyes, and her admiration for him grew even more. As expected of the Darkness Dragon, Brando heard such a voice in his heart, and the old witch smiled with satisfaction. Indeed, we need Sugarpot's help here. Brando thought to himself, as expected, but asked again, is she okay? What are you talking about? Princess Griffin couldn't help but ask when she heard them talking in riddles again. Her tone was slightly dissatisfied. There was no doubt that Her Royal Highness didn't like the feeling of Brando putting her aside. She told herself in her heart that she should be the eldest princess of Erewhon and should have more power to take the initiative. But in fact, the half-elf girl found it hard to admit that she just didn't want Brando to treat her as an outsider. She could faintly feel that Brando was different from the other nobles. The people gathered around him had formed a force that was completely different from the ancient nobles of the kingdom. This force was slightly similar to the students of the Royal Knight Academy that she had trained, but not exactly the same. The youths of the Royal Cavalry Academy had inherited her confusion. Together with her, they seemed to only be able to take one step at a time in an invisible net. She could feel that kind of despair. But she saw people like Carglass and Amandina who were full of confidence in the future, as if they already had a definite goal. In any case, this was enough for the princess to realize the difference between the forces around Brando and the traditional nobles. It seemed to be something she had always been looking forward to. Because of all this, she had begun to reject the original power structure of the kingdom. Nobles like Makarov, Fleetwood, and Duke Orek hoped to join Brando's side, even if it was not as a princess. She had such an impulse, but Griffin would never admit it. She even had a kind of contradiction, a contradiction that made her feel ashamed to speak out. So the princess kept a cold face and locked the secret in her heart, not revealing a single word. She looked at Brando and Babasha with her silver eyes, as if she wanted an explanation. Brando's heart moved slightly, and he looked at the old witch. Babasha didn't care and smiled dryly. It's actually very simple, Your Highness. This pool is actually a teleportation circle. A teleportation circle, that's impossible. Brando immediately replied. He had 10,000 reasons to believe that this was nonsense. The reason was that the players had already explored this point, but to no avail. He had a kind of blind trust in the information that was ahead of this world. Those guys would never make such a naive mistake. My lord is right, this can't be a teleportation circle. But in fact, it did leave some kind of message that can allow us to have a teleportation circle immediately. Babasha was not in a hurry, and instead replied with some appreciation. Brando was slightly startled, and then his eyes lit up. You mean that this fountain is actually a blueprint for a teleportation circle? He immediately asked. Exactly. This teleportation circle doesn't need the witches to draw it in a special way, does it? Wait, that's not enough, blood refinement, I get it. Brando suddenly reacted and suddenly realized, only the blood of a sugar jar can draw this teleportation circle, right? It's exactly as you expected. Babasha looked utterly convinced. But Brando was too lazy to care about her. He shouted in his heart, F***CK. These bastards are amazing. The designers of the Amber Sword were a bunch of scumbags. He didn't know whether to cry or laugh. This was obviously a series of quests. To open the third part of the ruins under Ampere's seal, it was obvious that the reputation of the witches was needed. But the problem was that there were Cruise people, Wind Elves, and Erewhon people in the game, but there were no Myrnas. Even Madara, who was originally a follower of the Dark Dragon, was at odds with the witches. The only place where the witches had the best reputation was probably under Georgandy Ridge, but unfortunately, there were no player forces down there. In other words, to open the reputation of the witches, one had to take the risk of going against the government. Although it was a little better than joining a cult like All for One, it was basically the kind of thing that wasn't liked. It wasn't that no players had chosen such a path, but the question was, how many had really succeeded? How many had succeeded and happened to meet the life and death witches? Among them, those who had entered the dungeon under Ampere's seal were even rarer. This was originally an early dungeon in Erewhon. Later, it wasn't occupied by Madara. Although Madara used to be on the same side as the witches, they later became mortal enemies because of the Dark Dragon. There were almost no well-known witches in Madara, which could explain a lot of problems. Because of this, no one in the game in his previous life discovered the secret here. Everything seemed to be natural, but Brando felt that the designers were a bunch of perverts. The purpose of the game design was to let players solve puzzles, but in his view, the puzzle in this ancient ruin was obviously unsolvable. If he hadn't crossed over. But now, there was finally an answer to this unsolvable problem. Drawing a teleportation circle didn't require too much blood, and it didn't need to kill Sugarpot as a blood sacrifice. If a kingdom needed to be saved by killing a little girl, Brando would rather take another path, even if it was bound to fail. And he believed that Her Royal Highness would support him. In fact, Her Royal Highness's eyes meant the same thing. However, she was more curious about whether such a teleportation circle could be used elsewhere. This statement aroused Brando's great interest. Indeed, a teleportation circle that could be drawn and effective temporarily, even if it could only teleport a dozen people, was more practical than the so-called Door of Flame of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After all, it was cheaper and easier to build. The Door of Flame seemed to be built by the Holy Cathedral of Fire in minutes, but it was the result of the joint efforts of more than 20 elemental rankers, not to mention the astronomical amount of money spent. If it weren't for the Holy War, Brando reckoned that the Holy Cathedral wouldn't be willing to invest in the Door of Flame for a mere civil war in Erewhon. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. No matter how important the geographical location in Erewhon was, it was insignificant in the eyes of the whole. The only difference was how much it would cost to appease its nobles, that was all. But what made the two of them feel pity was that Baba Shah said that this teleportation circle was a directional teleportation circle with fixed coordinates. In the past, its designer may have had the ability to design similar teleportation circles to other places, but that didn't mean that they could do it too. The technology of the inhabitants of the ruins had long been lost in the dust of history, and what the witches inherited was just a drop in the ocean. Such a result could be said to be expected, and Brando wasn't too regretful. He comforted the princess, but silently memorized the teleportation circle in his heart. This thing was also a magic circle, and it was also an alchemy work. Maybe in the future, the alchemy masters under him could improve it. Don't forget that he had Tamar, the most famous alchemy master in all of Wone in the future, and according to Tamar, Amandina's talent was no less inferior to or even surpassed his, although it was in the design and manufacture of arcanitech devices. But with the existence of these two powerful parties, Brando felt that anything was possible. He silently memorized the magic circle, and on the other side, Baba Shah had already drawn a huge magic circle on the ground with the sugar jar. Although the magic circle needed the sugar jar's blood, it wasn't all drawn with blood. Otherwise, it was estimated that the little witch wouldn't be able to draw it even if she drained all the blood in her body. The witches didn't allow outsiders to watch their process of making the magic circle, although Brando was an exception. But Brando had already faintly sensed the princess' thoughts, so he didn't bother to look at the map drawn by a few old women. Anyway, he knew what was going on. In terms of alchemy, he may not be as good as Baba Shah, but in terms of blood refining, there was probably no one present who could surpass him, a player. After all, Tamar's blood refining was taught by him. As soon as the magic circle was completed, everyone stood in it. Then the witches stood in the predetermined position and began to chant. What they sang was almost the same as before in the forest. It seemed that it should be a specific ancient rune here, like the password to open the door, which was also part of the witches' inheritance. As soon as the chanting began, Brando felt the surrounding scenery blurring. He felt Her Royal Highness gently grab his sleeve, but immediately let go. There was a flash in front of him, and then he was in a completely unfamiliar place. He raised his head. At that moment, he held his breath. He suddenly realized that he had forgotten a very important thing. That was, before going here, he didn't ask, "Baba Shah, have you been here before?" This dry sentence was almost squeezed out from Brando's teeth. Everyone, including the witches, looked up, dumbfounded. They all stared at the hall with their eyes wide open. "No. Sir Lord." Baba Shah swallowed a mouthful of saliva. This was probably the only time she showed an expression other than that dry smile since entering the underground ruins. It was a huge hall. In the center of the hall, above the dome, a spear that radiated lightning in all directions was suspended in midair. The blade of the spear was painted with a pattern of stars falling to the ground, and the curved text on the spear was the language of the Myrnas. On it was written the most famous motto in Cruz's epic from ancient times to the present: "The spear pierces the sky, and the stars fall to the ground." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 630. In the long history of Wonde, there were definitely a few major events that were destined to shine like bright stars in the night sky. But among them, the most brilliant one was undoubtedly the legend of the Azure Knight who held a long spear and opened up the era of mortals. In the epic of Cruz's creation, it was written as follows: "In the beginning, a world was born from a thought." At the beginning of everything, the world was in chaos, surrounded by water and wind, fire and lightning. Then, creatures were born in the water and multiplied on the earth. They were also blessed by the wind and endowed with wisdom by the fire. Martha said a name from her mouth, Nana Ainta. 1. Light, darkness, wind, water, fire, and earth, the 6 elements surrounded this world. In the original rules, 14,000 gods were formed to take charge of all of this. It was done. In the first era before the glory, too, the gods built a kingdom on the earth surrounded by clouds and mist. The giant tower that reached the sky connected the mortals and the gods' kingdom. But then, everything was destroyed in the flames of war. This was recorded in the Pale poem. Players had speculated more than once that this war was a magnificent war between the gods, the Golden Race, and the Twilight Dragon. That was the history of Wonde long ago. The opposition of all intelligent creatures and the Twilight Dragon seemed to have existed since the beginning of the era. After the collapse of the First Era, the record of the Azure Knight appeared for the first time in history. The epic wrote as follows: "The Azure Knight shouted to the mountains, 'Mountains, I challenge you.' The mountains responded to him. Let the ice and snow fall on his shoulders, let the cold wind make him unable to move forward, let the fog obscure his vision, and let the cold take away his right hand and eyes." But the Azure Knight was destined to be the owner of the spear. The hero stood on top of the mountains, firm and unwavering. Like this, a year passed, and another year passed. The mountains whispered, "Look, this is the owner of the spear." They bowed down and called him king. That spear shattered the sky, pierced the heart of the Twilight Dragon, caused the stars to fall to the ground, and thus started the second era of the era of mortals, the Holy Spear. The Holy Spear, the sky. 3. Everyone present was so familiar with this record, whether they were a human or an elf, a knight or a princess, or even a witch. It was as if they had been told all this from the moment they were born. It was a history that everyone who lived on this continent was familiar with, whether it was a farmer in a remote place or a learned noble. Everyone knew about it. That period of history was so far away from people that it was like a legend. However, it was true and credible, and the stars in the sky could testify to it. The legendary Holy Sky Spear was 9 feet long, its spear all was like a shuttle, and its entire body was like jade. Hence, it was also known as the Azure Spear. After the fall of the Azure Knight and the Twilight Dragon, the Myrnas recovered the weapon from the plains east of present-day Cruz and Saint-Tassol. They carved a motto on the blade of the spear pierced the sky, and the stars fell to the ground, in memory of the hero who saved the entire world. And that gun was exactly the same as the one Brendel and the others were looking at right now. There was no difference. This is... The knight could not help but stare in shock. No one was willing to believe that the legendary weapon would appear in front of them without any warning and caught them off guard. There was a widespread legend that mentioned that when the Darkness Dragon died, the Myrnas who followed him brought the Azure Spear into the depths of the glacier and buried it forever. But what was going on with this scene in front of them? Brando only felt a buzzing sound in his head. The most famous weapon in the Amber Sword was undoubtedly the Amber Sword that was rumored to be able to fight against the fate of all things and the world. However, the Holy Sky Spear and the Amber Sword were both weapons of the Azure Knight, and had also left an illustrious reputation in history. In fact, when it came to the extent of the legend, the Azure Spear was far more famous than the Amber Sword. Even in Erewhon or Cruz, only a few people knew about the existence of the Amber Sword. These people were either aristocrats with a long history of family learning or knowledgeable scholars. But the key was... it was actually here. Brando knew that the Holy Sky Spear had appeared more than once in the history of Won't, and there were even several huge scams that revolved around this famous gun. The reason was simple, because it had never appeared in history. From the fall of the Azure Knight to the collapse of the Darkness Dragon Odin's dark reign, it was as if it had disappeared from history and never appeared again. For a weapon with such an illustrious reputation to be so silent, no matter how you looked at it, it was abnormal. And because of this, it had attracted the interest of the most players in history. Brando knew that many guilds were secretly looking for the whereabouts of the Azure Spear. But it was actually here. Could it be a fake? The eldest princess of Erewhon had the highest status in this group and was the most knowledgeable. She was the first to react and asked with an uncertain tone. This was also Brando's first reaction, but the reverberating pressure in the hall made it hard to believe that this was just a fake. More importantly, he first thought of the witch empress who was sleeping under Tonajol. Could she have brought the Azure Spear here? But why didn't she tell the Roman? But he immediately rejected this conjecture, because the history of the ruins under Ampier's seal was obviously much older. In other words, the Azure Spear might have been sleeping in this place long before that. But how could the witch's heritage be related to this place? Brando couldn't help but look back at Baba Shah, and the old witch herself had a look of disbelief on her face. Maybe the Darkness Dragon hid it here. Baba Shah replied somewhat dryly in the telepathic communication. But this statement didn't convince Brando, and he always felt that there was something wrong with it. Sure enough, the majestic power outside soon awakened Saint-Tassol, the Wind Empress. Saint-Tassol just looked at the spear in the hall and couldn't help but let out a low cry. "Ah, you actually found the Azure Spear." But she immediately reacted and reprimanded, "Brando, this witch's words are impossible." Why? Brando saw that the Elf Queen didn't throw a tantrum at the critical moment and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. The Wind Empress snorted coldly, "The Amber Sword, the Azure Spear, if Odin had one of them, how could we win?" "Brando, you underestimate the power of the divine artifact." "That's right." Brando then realized that the problem he felt was in this place. Whether it was the Azure Spear or the Amber Sword, they were both genuine divine artifacts. The power of the divine artifacts in the world of Woned was extraordinary and had long been beyond the scope of mortal imagination. In a war on the scale of the War of the Holy Saints, hundreds and thousands of races were involved. At that time, the most powerful forces in the world gathered together, but the only divine artifact that appeared was the blade of fiery flame. The power of the divine artifacts could often change history, and they would only appear when history was about to undergo major changes. Just like the narration in the Pale poem, the former king obtained the sword on the plains, and then signed a sacred covenant with the intelligent creatures to resist the darkness dragon's rule on the earth. That would be another legend. Your Highness, I'm afraid we have to take it down to distinguish its authenticity. At this time, Brando heard one of the Lantern Island knights suggest. He looked back and saw the princess frowning and asked, "Take it down, how do we take it down?" Everyone was stunned by this question. Hanging in this hall was probably the most powerful sacred object since the First Era. Its power could not only change the fate of a kingdom, but even the fate of the entire continent. But the question was, would there be no trap next to such a powerful divine artifact? Or rather, not to mention that it was a trap, its own power was enough to turn those who harbored evil intentions into ashes. And who dared to say that they had no selfish motives and dared to go up and take the spear of the holy saints? Or rather, who present thought that they were qualified to be compared to the knight of the azure spear? The knight could not help but look at each other speechlessly, but Brando soon found that all eyes fell on him. The witches, the knight, and even Her Highness Griffin looked at him without saying anything, and the meaning contained in their gazes was obvious. If fate had summoned everyone here, then the most qualified person here to pick up the spear was undoubtedly Brando. But Brando secretly screamed in his heart, "Damn it. It was not that easy to pick up a divine artifact." It was fate, and the divine artifact recognized its master. It sounded very awesome, but in fact, most of the people who thought so ended up very miserable. If he was really Brando, maybe he would really be tempted, but half of his soul was first of all a player, and he knew very well what it was. A real divine artifact. The holy spear was eternal. He hesitated for a moment and carefully asked, "Your Highness, I know what you mean. But if we want to take down this holy spear, how long do you think it will take?" The princess looked at him in confusion. "Can't we take it down?" Brando suddenly realized that the princess seemed to know nothing about this matter. But then again, how could mortals have so many opportunities to learn about divine artifacts? Those things seemed to be illusory, unattainable existences. He could only patiently explain, more or less, first of all, the divine artifact itself has its own will. Secondly, this hall must be densely packed with traps, and collecting the divine artifact is an extremely dangerous and time-consuming thing, unless someone can resonate with it and make it automatically recognize its master. Do we have so much time to waste? Princess Griffin could not help but frown. Hearing Brando say this, she seemed to have realized the problem. They did not seem to have so much time to waste in this place. "I'm afraid not." Brando shook his head as expected. The crux of the problem was not here. Obtaining the divine artifact was a very dangerous task, and if they succeeded in their gamble here, naturally all the problems would be solved. For a divine artifact like the azure spear, once its power was mastered, it would be a piece of cake to beat the demons and cavemen on the surface back to their homes. But the problem was that if they failed, then Erwin would not have the chance to start over. "Brendel, what about the subterranean dwellers outside?" she asked. What about the subterranean dwellers outside? Brendel knew that she wanted to ask if the subterranean dwellers outside were also looking for this thing. He suddenly felt that it was very possible, but where did the demons get this information? Then is it safe to leave it here? After thinking about it, although she was a little reluctant, the princess gritted her teeth and asked. For this question, Brando could only look at Baba Shah. The old witch was also uneasy in her heart, and to be honest, she was not sure. That was the holy spear of heaven, a weapon that existed countless years ago in myths and legends that could defeat the Twilight Dragon. In that era, the silver races were only considered cannon fodder, and even earlier, the divine people still walked the earth. But she still calmed down and nodded. "Sir, no one can come in here except us." That was enough. Of all the people present, the one who could take things the most easily was Brando. As half a player, he could only see the Holy Spear of Heaven as a divine artifact with great power. But so what if it was a divine artifact? It was just a piece of equipment. Of course, with that said, Brando was still a little worried. He could only turn his head and try not to look at the thing, and replied, "In that case, everyone should forget about this for the time being." He gave the people present a stern look, especially the Knight of Lantern Island. He was not afraid that the Azure Spear would fall into the hands of the cavemen of Georgandy Ridge. The divine artifacts had their own will and carried their own destiny, so how could they be easily lost? But if this news were to spread, Erwin would be in big trouble. The knight understood what Brando meant, and all of them swore not to spread the word. Brando listened to their vows for the time being, and he looked on coldly. After all, he had his own way to deal with all of this after everything had calmed down. The means of the players were not something these guys could imagine. So everyone left the hall one by one under Brando's lead, and everyone seemed a little distracted. The shock of the Azure Spear to them was really indescribable, and even Brando found it hard to understand the special feelings the natives had for that period of history. It was like saying that those mythical characters he knew but did not believe suddenly appeared in front of him, telling him that everything in the past was real. He could only vaguely see such a meaning from the thoughtful eyes of Her Royal Highness. But just as he was about to leave the hall, he suddenly remembered something. As he knew, the power of the divine artifacts could often change history, and they would only appear when history was about to undergo major changes. In the recent history, the Flame King obtained Odorfice on the plains, and then signed a sacred covenant with the intelligent creatures to resist the rule of the Darkness Dragon on the earth. So what did the appearance of the Azure Spear in Erwin mean? At least he knew that the destiny of the Azure Spear was not to save this ancient kingdom. Brando was horrified. However, just as Medusa Lysimachus did not know about the huge changes that were brewing under this huge port, Brando did not know what was happening on the ground. The beautiful lady raised her head in the rain and saw a golden red light floating in front of her and the Minotaur Lord, who was as dumb as an ox. No, an ox. Her beautiful prismatic pupils reflected a magnificent red, and a huge door of light crossed half the sky, forming a giant flaming door with a diameter of dozens of meters in the pouring rain. Then, a fiery red demon with 3 heads and a pair of huge fleshy wings on its back slowly walked out from behind the door. Even though the portal was so huge, the demon had to hunch its body and squeeze through the door. In fact, even so, its huge horns almost could not pass through. Lysimachus looked at the behemoth carefully, and then respectfully greeted, "Dear Lord Messica, you have finally arrived. Lord Valabar has been waiting for a long time." The huge demon looked at her, showing an expression that could hardly be called a smile, and replied gruffly, "What about the preparations of the bugs?" "Of course, they are ready, my lord." 1. Myrna language, wound. 2. It does not refer to the first or second era of the cruise calendar, but the first era. According to the player's research, this era should be before the Chaos era. And the beginning of the second era was the beginning of the Chaos era. 3. Races other than humans are called Sky. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 631. The hills to the north of Ampere Seal were connected to the relatively flat terrain around the bay. Large pine forests were scattered on the rolling hillsides, and the woodlands were densely covered with shrubs. The edge of the woodlands was downwards, and the view was extremely open on the gentle slope. But today, looking at the direction of the huge grey port, the land was scorched black, as if it had been burned once. 3 huge portals stood on the scorched earth, like 3 huge golden rings of fire. Peering through the portals, one could see a world of flowing lava. It was the Sulphur River under Georgandy Ridge, and legend said that it was connected to the scorched hell of the fire elemental plane. Countless demons crowded around the portals, including the most numerous red-skinned imps and the more terrifying longhorn demons. These low-level demons with low status and intelligence fought with each other by the portals, tearing apart human limbs. It was disgusting. Then Brando saw hundreds of hellhounds resting on one side of the hill, led by a few 3-headed hellhound leaders. In addition, there were a few red-skinned demon warlocks by the portals, who looked almost like humans except for the long horns on their heads. These higher-level demons, who were more cunning than the average person, were watching the low-level demons fight with interest. Such a battle would often turn into a bloody battle, and one side would even cruelly kill the other. But this wasn't strange among demons. Instead, it was a common sight. They were originally a bunch of chaotic and twisted magical creatures. Brando wore the cloak handed to him by the princess and hid in the bushes to calmly observe all this. Only he could see all this clearly without the help of the brass binoculars. The port of Ampere Seal had become a hell. He sighed quietly, and did not have the heart to pray for the souls of the dead. Although those who died in the hands of the demons also had relatives, friends, and even lovers, to be honest, if one did not personally experience it, one would be more or less indifferent to the disaster of others. This was not human nature, but the instinct of living creatures to protect themselves. To be honest, Brando himself was not so sympathetic, but he was only here to try to save as much as possible what he cared about. He had told himself that history had brought him back here, and his goal was to save this ancient kingdom and prevent the tragedy from repeating. If he gave up on this goal, Brando was afraid that he would be completely swallowed by this huge world. All his confidence came from the half-fairy princess beside him, who was looking sadly in the direction of the port of Ampere Seal with her silver eyes. "What have we done wrong?" Griffin could not help but mutter to herself. Brando couldn't understand her confusion, because this kingdom didn't have the meaning of history to him, only the meaning of the future. Just like how the princess was willing to put herself in danger to protect the Anderla Cathedral, he was willing to tear down the entire cathedral just to ensure her safety. But he could completely understand it. To him, there was no right or wrong between him and the princess. It was just that their views were completely different. Erwin's people didn't do anything wrong, but Cruz's people did. "Little princess, the justice represented by Lady Martha is just your wishful thinking," Baba Shah said with a smile. "The Supreme One of all things will not give the corresponding punishment because someone has done evil, but only because of the cause, and this is justice. For anyone who lived under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this was simply heresy." But Her Royal Highness' lips moved slightly, but she didn't refute it. Her heart was soft as water, but as hard as iron. Her hatred for Cruz's people had long made her suspicious of the teachings of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But she knew that she couldn't believe the word. Brendel actually agreed with Babash's statement. Martha represented absolute order, the Holy Cathedral of Fire understood it as narrow fairness, the Holy Cathedral of Light understood it as serious self-discipline, the Wind Elves thought it should be no change and reverence for the law, and the people of Eloranta believed that following nature was the way of all things. But in fact, Martha herself was related to everyone, and also had nothing to do with them. The witches believed in this point best, and they never worshipped Martha as a real god, but only with respect. But he felt quite disdainful that Baba Shah was here to take the opportunity to strike at the princess's self-confidence. The witches themselves were also in trouble, and who in this world could really break free from their own fate? Baba Shah was just taking advantage of her seniority. "Baba Shah, put the crystal ball on." He reminded her lightly, "If you have anything to say, you can say it after you survive." The old witch smiled embarrassedly. She naturally knew that her thoughts had been seen through by the dark dragon. But this was not unexpected. She took out a crystal ball from under her robe, although this action really made Brando wonder where she had hidden it before. Then she put the crystal ball on the ground. The crystal ball soon lit up. Wood's unpleasant old face appeared on it. Brando really didn't have a good impression of this archbishop who played him. "Mr. Brando, your royal highness, how far have you progressed?" The Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire didn't seem to be in the mood to ask questions at this moment, so he went straight to the point. This question made Brando feel very ambiguous, especially when this old guy asked in front of him and the princess. What did he want? But the flashes of the explosion on the crystal ball illuminated Wood's wrinkled face from time to time, especially at this time. The wrinkles on his face seemed to have deepened. Although this spell had blocked the noise outside, it was not difficult for Brando to imagine that the battle over there must be very fierce. He couldn't help but worry about Freya, Carglass, and the others. And when he thought of Freya, he thought of the merchant lady who had not been heard from so far, and his joking mood faded. "We have arrived." Brando replied concisely, "From our position, we are no more than 2 kilometers away from the portal. But there are many demons over there. I will put down the anchor point next, and you will find a way to teleport the people I need." At this point, he suddenly remembered and asked, "I may need a few Knight of the Holy Cathedral. How is the situation over there? Can you transfer them?" "Fortunately, as long as you don't teleport the entire First Fleet over." Wood smiled bitterly, "We can probably hold on for a while." When he said this, Brando knew that the battle over there must be very difficult. With the pride of the cruise people, they would never say that they were so reliant on Erwin's fleet. It was conceivable that the battle on the other side had reached the point of exhaustion. Brando knew that Wood didn't want to put any more pressure on him, but he still felt a heavy feeling out of thin air. There was not much time left. "Then, do you need those people, Mr. Brendel?" Wood asked in a serious tone. "I need people who are not afraid of death, Lord Archbishop." Garlock the Wanderer stood on the side of HMS Victory and watched the battle on the ground without saying a word. In the rain, the Wyvern Knight, the Pegasus Knight of the cruise people, and the Harpies were in a melee. The flames of the explosions almost lit up half the sky, and the old wizard was in the center of this battlefield. Every time the light of magic flashed in his hand, it was as if an invisible ripple swept across most of the battlefield, and countless harpies were smashed to pieces. But soon, someone called him from behind. "Mr. Garlock, is it?" Garlock turned back alertly. As the chief wizard of Duke Cypher, the disappearance of the Duke had made him smell danger. He took the initiative to participate in the battle to avoid being involved in that huge whirlpool. "Yes." He nodded. "Can you come with me?" It was a beautiful female officer who asked. Garlock had an amazing memory. He remembered seeing her once with Count Janalesu. And now the commander of the fleet should be with the cruise people. What did they want him to do? He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. On different warships, the same scene was playing out over and over again. A fully armored knight appeared beside the blazing swordsman Nicholas and asked respectfully, "Are you Master Nicholas?" "Count Yenbao, is it? Please come with me." "Miss Amandina, your lord wants to see you." Soon, the 7 candidates were already in the flagship command room of HMS Victory. Except for Amandina, the Shire, and Dilfery, the other 4 were elemental awakened powerhouses. Among them, blazing swordsman Nicholas and Garlock the Wanderer were masters of the elemental enlightenment. Brando tried to choose Erwin people because except for clear-headed clergymen like Wood, it was difficult for the cruise people to really put themselves in the shoes of the kingdom. In contrast, although blazing swordsmen Nicholas and Garlock were enemies not long ago, they were more reliable. What's more, Brando knew that they were not members of All for One. Even if it was to prove their innocence, they would do their best. Of course, it was inevitable that he had some dark plans. If he failed, the northern nobles would lose at least two of their strongest fighters. That way, Freya and the rest of Trenthiem's forces in the south would have an easier time. Of course, this was nothing but self-consolation. Brando, you want me? After hearing Brando's request, Amandina could still remain calm. She actually knew that Brando might borrow her knowledge of alchemy and magic, but the Countess of Yenbao couldn't help but be stunned. What are you saying? What do you mean by I want you? Brando couldn't help sweating, but he didn't expect the Countess to look so happy. No, I don't want to refuse. But I want to ask, can I really help with something like this? Of course, teleportation consumes magic power. Do you think this is the time to waste magic power? Brando was a little speechless. I let you come because you are better than the others and can play a role that others can't at this time. Brando didn't say anything because everyone understood the danger of this mission. The people who went with him were likely to die, or even be wiped out. He was not stingy with his praise for people who could face life and death. In fact, any praise would pale in comparison to their actions. So, are you willing? Yes, I'm very willing. Lord Archbishop, Mr. Brando, thank you very much for choosing me. The expression on Dilferi's face was not fake at all. In fact, Brando also knew that this young lady was too simple to fake anything. But was it really worth being happy about? Could it be that she's brainwashed by the spirit of chivalry just like Eek? Brendel thought to himself, is this girl brainwashed by the spirit of chivalry? But looking at the Countess's blushing face, he didn't want to continue undermining her self-confidence. He turned his gaze and saw Garlock talking to the Shire. You are the Shire of the Peloche family. Garlock didn't seem to be worried about what would happen next. Instead, he asked calmly. Yes, the Shire replied in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. The genius of the Highlands, I've heard of you. Unfortunately, you are a Highland wizard. Otherwise, I would have made you my apprentice. Unfortunately, Erewhon people can't choose their own fate, Garlock said softly. It's all in the past, and I'm no longer the Shire. I'm dead, but I have a new life. Besides, the people of Aween are not necessarily unable to choose their own destiny. Seal replied with a smile. Is that so? I heard that in the end, you really did return to the mountains of Alkash. What did you see there? What did the Marshal see in the end? The Shire smiled but didn't answer. That's not important, is it? Yes. Garlock seemed to have thought of something. He was slightly startled, but then slowly nodded. Hearing their conversation, Wood frowned slightly. He turned to Brando and said, I've found the people you need. Brando, I've found all the people you want, except for Mr. Nigel. Unfortunately, he has died in battle, Wood replied. Is that so? Brando was slightly startled. He didn't expect that the famous unshakable sword in history would die here. History said that the old general would only fall in the Second War of the Black Roses. At this moment, he deeply felt the change in history. He looked at the remaining two Sanctum Knight and was about to nod, but it was at this moment that a voice came from the other side of the crystal. Since the unshakable sword is dead, as a soldier of the same era as him, shall I take over his task? It was a loud, old voice, and then a tall figure pushed open the door and entered. Archbishop, what do you think? Wood raised his head and looked at the former commander of the White Lion Legion in surprise. But the old man had taken off the White Lion Legion's armor and was wearing the most ordinary military uniform. Commander Leiter. As I said, I'm no longer the commander of the Legion, Archbishop. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 632. Our goal is very simple. There are a total of 3 portals. If even one is left behind, the mission will be a failure. The task of finding and analyzing the portal will be handed over to Miss Amandina. Everyone else's task, including me, is to cover her as she approaches the portal and protect her before she completes it. Do you have any other questions? Brando looked at everyone. They would be facing thousands of demons later, and no one expected to succeed except for him. Most of the people present only saw this operation as a noble act. On the one hand, there were less than 40 people, and on the other hand, there was an uncountable demon army. Other than a miracle, they really could not imagine the possibility of victory. Some of the Lantanila Knight looked nervous, some frowned, and some seemed to be joking nonchalantly. The usually silent Garlock was demonstrating a spell model to the Shire. The sword master of Cipher, Nicholas, was wiping his long sword over and over again. Her Royal Highness was alone, staring at the dark Ampere seal in the rain in a daze. No one knew what she was thinking. These actions seemed meaningless, but more or less revealed a sense of uneasiness. When the final moment was so close, who would be able to face death with equanimity? But even so, everyone nodded silently. They did not know that the young man still had a glimmer of hope in his heart. They only thought that it was a kind of knight's persistence and determination. Knowing that he would fail but still launching a challenge, such persistence was still a little naive in the eyes of most nobles of this era. But it was also commendable, because no one could blaspheme the pursuit of ideals and honor. Because of this, everyone only had admiration for Brando. Brando could more or less feel the meaning of this, but he did not intend to explain this misunderstanding. Well, we've wasted too much time. We only have 5 minutes to prepare. Then we'll set off immediately. Please hurry up, or leave a will. You and I should both understand that this time, we will definitely die. Everyone was silent. Only the Shire smiled and said, "It's a pity. There should have been a chance for future generations to erect a monument for us to record the heroic deeds that happened here today. The monument would be inscribed, 'The Great Lord of Tonajol and his entourage,' but now it seems that there won't be such a chance. Whether or not anyone will remember us in the future is still a question." The young sorcerer described the situation vividly. "Why can't you remember?" Dilfari asked curiously. "It's very simple. Because a certain righteous temple will definitely hide the truth, but can we stand up and refute it?" The Shire replied sinisterly, and then could not help but smile. This joke was very interesting. The key point was that it was in line with the malicious speculations that people had about Cruz. Wasn't this the work of Cruz and the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Although everyone was now united to fight against the demons, there was not a trace of displeasure in their hearts, especially the Knight of Anthony, who laughed unscrupulously. Brando couldn't help but smile. It seemed that the Shire's opinion of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was not small, but it had to be said that what he said was likely to happen in the future, if they really died here. In fact, even the only knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the crowd shook his head with a smile after hearing the Shire's words. As a high-ranking member of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, he naturally knew how the Holy Cathedral of Fire did things, but this was not unacceptable to him. He was loyal to his faith, not the way the Holy Cathedral of Fire did things. Brando broke away from the crowd and walked to the edge of the forest. He glanced at the gentle slope in the north and couldn't help but sigh. Some things were easy to say, but difficult to do. The area between the hills in the north of Ampere Seal and the bay was a gently sloping meadow. Such terrain was really not suitable for a surprise attack. The vision of the imps was limited, but the hellhounds were the best scouts. He was afraid that they would be discovered as soon as they left the forest. Once discovered, he couldn't help but feel a little desperate at the thought of the dense and increasing number of demons by the portal. He couldn't help but think that it would be better to fight in the hills, but unfortunately, the demons were not stupid. What's more, they had no choice. At this time, a rustling sound of footsteps came from behind. Brando didn't need to look back to know that it was the Countess of Yenbao. Only she would be so clumsy and make such a loud noise. Mr. Brando. You want to ask what you can do? Brando replied without looking back. You're definitely not popular with girls at all, Mr. Brendel, Dilfrey stuttered for a moment before replying helplessly. I just want to know what I can do, Mr. Brendel. Are you interested in my ability to summon demons? Ha, Brando laughed dryly. You guessed it. There's no other possibility. Dilfrey frowned. But I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. Although I secretly learned the art of necromancy, I can only summon a very low-level demon. Brando couldn't help but look at her. Is that so? But I also have a question. Countess, are you not afraid at all? You know what it means to be here, don't you? He looked at his watch. There were still 3 minutes left. There was still a lot of time, so he asked the question that he had been curious about for a long time. He could more or less guess the reason why Leiter, the head of the White Lion Legion, chose to join. That great man was a tragic character in history, and could be said to be a tragic hero. He was one of the few nobles who were completely different from Erwin, but he chose a path that was destined to be wrong. To be honest, Brando did not agree with Leiter's choice. As an individual, he might be admirable, but from the old man's position, he was too short-sighted. Because of his wrong judgment, the future of the kingdom was ruined. Such a mistake could not be ignored because of a righteous purpose. But if Leiter wanted to make up for his mistake, Brando was very curious about the actions of the Countess of Yenbao. Although she was his intended candidate, her reaction was too outstanding, as if the spirit of a knight was overflowing. This was not quite the same as Brando's impression of her. Dilfrey hesitated for a moment, but finally nodded seriously. I know I may die here, Mr. Brando. Brando listened to her continue and said, but I'm not the only heir of the Yenbao family. If I die here today, the Sword Protector's family will only be honored because of me, and wash away the shame brought about by the shattering of the Sword Throne. If I live, the family will not be reborn. If I die, I can't decide the fate of myself and the family. So I think, maybe I can at least decide the value of my life. Dilfrey looked at Brando seriously. Besides, I'd rather die heroically and gloriously. Isn't it romantic to die beside a real knight and shed my last drop of blood for this kingdom? She smiled slightly, with the gentleness of a noble lady. Romantic my ass. Brendel could not understand her inexplicable spirit of sacrifice, just like how he could not understand the nobles restricting a person's freedom for the sake of their family. He looked at the Countess, and for the first time, he felt that there was an invisible gap between them. Is it worth it? Yes. Dilfrey nodded firmly. Well, Brando shrugged and decided to change the topic. But then again, is the shattering of the Sword Throne that serious for you? Of course, Yenbao once swore an oath to protect the Sword Throne. The shattering of the Sword Throne means that the Lionheart sword has to choose a new master, which is a huge blow to us. The family has to face the criticism and blame of those who covet it. I see. Brando suddenly understood. In fact, he had already guessed it. If Yenbao had not been in trouble, they would not have let a little girl like Dilfrey run around. But isn't the Lionheart sword back in the hands of the princess? Mr. Brando, back then, we swore an oath to the Cipher royal family. Later, the Lionheart sword went missing. Fortunately, the Sword Throne still exists. Therefore, Covardo's ancestors swore an oath to inherit the throne in front of the Sword Throne. Today, the Yenbao family is loyal to the Covardo royal family, not the princess, the Countess explained in detail. Brando completely understood after hearing her words. But to be honest, even if he understood the whole story, he could not understand her choice. He was silent for a moment, then took out a ring-shaped object from the dimensional space. Your family will be honored because of you, but to be honest, I regret it. Brando replied quietly. Mr. Brando, you don't have to. Dilfari saw the object and widened her eyes. This is Devil's Armband. Brando nodded slowly. 5 minutes was not a long time. When Brando and Dilfari came back from the periphery of the forest, everyone was ready to go. He did not say much. In fact, he was not in the mood to say much. He just nodded and led everyone to set off. They passed through the forest and soon entered the gentle slope in the north. Before this, Brendel had told himself more than once that this adventure was no different from his past experiences in the game. Whether it was the earlier experience of killing his way out of the Lizardman's encirclement, or the Second War of the Black Roses where he risked his life to ambush Madara's undead, or the later Operation Four-Leaf Clover where he passed information under the noses of the Kurlots. He succeeded every time, didn't he? But until the moment before they set off, everyone's silence made him feel a little different. There seemed to be a tense atmosphere in the air, which reminded him more than once of that night in Butchie. Through the gaps between the layers of branches and leaves, the portals of the Door of Flame were like 3 huge golden rings standing in the rain. Just these things alone were enough to make people feel great pressure. Fortunately, in order to ensure a clear space near the portal, there was not a single flying creature in the entire northern sky of Ampere Seal. Whether it was the brute devils or the harpies. This was probably the only thing that Brando felt comforted about. The demons were probably very confident in the forces near the portal, and there were no patrols in the surrounding hilly areas. Of course, the demons did not have any patrols in the first place. Their fighting style had always been straightforward, violent and direct. They just used their lives to fill in the gaps. On the other hand, Brando originally thought that they would encounter Jorgandi Ridge, but it seemed that his luck was not bad. He carefully led the others through the bushes while nervously looking at the hill where the Hellhound was resting. However, the Hellhound did not seem to realize that there would be an army appearing in the north of Ampere Seal. Soon, they successfully entered the sparse woodland near the gentle slope of the meadow. Brando took the lead and rolled to the outermost tree in the woodland. He took a look outside. The nearest teleportation gate was less than a kilometer away from him. Because the teleportation gate was so huge, it was almost within reach. Brando took a breath and immediately turned back to signal the others. Everyone lowered their bodies and crept closer to the edge of the woodland. To be honest, this action was nothing new. Scouts often used this method to get close to the enemy, and even taught their horses to do the same. However, if there was a reconnaissance unit in the air, doing this in the endless meadow was tantamount to suicide. However, Brando was eyeing the clear area near the portal. They slowly crawled out of the woodland and slowly entered the meadow. Brando raised his head slightly from time to time to see the reaction of the Hellhounds. Among all the demons, the Hellhounds deserved to be called the first in terms of perception. Even the higher-level Longhorn demons were inferior to them in this aspect. However, Martha was obviously on their side this time. After moving forward for 300 to 400 meters, although it took a full 10 minutes, the Hellhounds still did not react at all until they were almost half the distance. However, their good luck obviously ended here. Suddenly, Brando saw the 3-headed Hellhound stand up vigilantly. If he still felt lucky at this time, then when the monster looked in this direction, he would immediately realize that his group had been discovered. At this distance, it was very likely that the other party did not see them, but because it smelled the scent of humans. It had to be said that even though Brando was prepared for this kind of smell, he still could not help but be secretly shocked. It must be known that they were in the middle of a torrential downpour. If it was a sunny day, they probably would not be able to hide in the forest. The 2 major reconnaissance units of the demons, the brute devils in the sky and the Hellhounds on the ground, their illustrious reputation was not exaggerated by the players. Brando only saw the 6 pairs of blood-red eyes sweep in this direction. He immediately felt his scalp tingle and subconsciously shouted, "Amandina." The noble lady understood tacitly and immediately approached him. Brando got up from the ground and picked her up by the waist. He immediately sprinted toward the teleportation gate in front of him. "Quick! Let's destroy the nearest portal first." As soon as he moved, the hellhounds on the hill stood up in unison. The longhorn demons by the portal reacted a little slower. These tall demons immediately kicked away the little demons who were fighting and ordered them to prepare to meet the enemy immediately while cursing. Then the figures of the demon warlocks appeared by the portal. These monsters originally seemed to be hidden in the large group of imps. As soon as they stood up, they immediately ignited blood-red flames in their hands and then threw them at Brando and the others like raindrops. Brando held Amandina in one hand and pulled out Halran Gaia with the other. He was very familiar with these goat-horn demons and naturally knew their usual tricks. He was about to meet the attack, but it was at this time that the Temple Knight and flame-haired Nicholas came in front of him, one on the left and one on the right. They stretched out their hands and countless golden red lines of law immediately extended forward and swallowed all the fireballs. In front of these 2 masters of fire, the fireballs of the demon warlocks were really not enough. Brando immediately heaved a sigh of relief. The reason why he specifically asked Nicholas to join was actually because of this. Demons were all experts at playing with fire, but compared to Nicholas, who had the enlightenment of truth, it was child's play. P.S. Return the Fury card to me, Neil. Explode at the beginning of the month tomorrow. Write a thank you letter while you're at it. Sigh, I'm too embarrassed to write it at this time. I apologize to everyone. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Calm to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 633. After the fireball, hordes of imps began to move out from the portal. These demons, who were only as tall as a human child and were as red as fire, could not be called an army at all. However, their numbers alone were overwhelming. Brando held Amandina in his arms and looked up to see a dense and frightening dark red sea. It was as if red paint had not passed through a green palette but had just rolled up. Countless imps flapped their wings and staggered up dozens of meters into the air. For a moment, the entire battlefield rose up from the ground like a tsunami. For a moment, only locust-like imps were left on the ground and in the air. They covered the sky and covered the sun. Amandina was so scared that she almost stopped breathing. Her fingertips turned white as she gripped Brando's shoulder tightly. In the blink of an eye, the sky full of imps rushed down like a huge wave. She was so scared that she immediately closed her eyes and turned her head to Brando's chest. "Get ready to fight." Brando roared. The knight raised their heads and prepared to meet the first wave of impact. Long live the kingdom. Long live Erwin. No one knew who was the first to shout, but the few voices were slightly weak in the overwhelming screams. But everyone's heart was surging. This was the dream of a hero that belonged to everyone. Reality had locked the pace of men and women, but until that moment really came, everyone could laugh loudly, cry happily, and shout to their heart's content. In a situation where life and death had lost their color, any scruples could only be turned into the most sincere of emotions. The knight was going to dedicate their lives to their motherland. Even if it was only for a second, it could become eternal. Life and death had long been disregarded. Next, they just had to use their swords to determine the winner. This was the only thought left in everyone's mind. The huge wave crashed head-on. Everyone subconsciously held their breath, but at that moment, a thunderous roar suddenly exploded behind them. "I demand the law of power." The old wizard Garlock's hair and beard stood up. He stepped forward and pushed his 5 fingers into the void. Back off! He roared angrily, and a transparent halo spread out in all directions with him as the center. However, if one looked closely, it was not a halo, but a splash of water that was being pushed away. The little evil demon that was still flapping its wings and leaping forward in midair was slapped by an invisible giant hand the next moment. It screamed and flew back. Some of them even flew hundreds of meters and crashed into the metal platform of the portal, their brains splattering everywhere. It was as if a giant dragon had breathed out, and the entire sky had calmed down. Attack forward! Brando took the opportunity to swing his sword forward, roaring as he charged forward. He raised his sword and drew an arc of watery light in the curtain of rain. With a slash of his sword, just the pressure of the sword pushed the rainwater to the sides. The wind pressure formed swept forward, sweeping into the dense formation of the imps. The first row of imps that bore the brunt of the attack seemed to have been crushed by an iron hammer. Their forward momentum paused, and their heads and chests suddenly deformed at a speed visible to the naked eye. They were strangely flattened and folded backward, and in a moment, they exploded backward like a pink mist of minced meat. With a loud bang, the first 3 rows of imps in front of Brando's half-arc turned into a mist of blood, and more of their kind were directly blown away by the pressure of the sword. The next moment, the pressure of the sword completely erupted. Countless invisible blades exploded in all directions like a storm, and for a moment, countless limbs flew into the sky, accompanied by a series of screams. The might of this sword actually created a perfect circle within a radius of 30 meters. At least 20 little demons were turned into minced meat under this sword, and the number of broken limbs was even more uncountable. The knight did not have time to cheer, and immediately rushed forward to occupy the open space, but at the same time, the whole team was surrounded by an ocean of imps. Dozens of imps swarmed forward and completely surrounded a knight of Lantern Island. They used their claws, teeth, and even bites on the knight's arm or shoulder armor. The knight struggled to resist, and turned around to pierce the throat of the imp that tried to climb up from the back of his horse. However, more imps grabbed his arm tightly at the same time, making his movements more and more difficult. In the end, after the knight killed 3 or 4 imps, an imp finally lifted the helmet and scratched his face with its claws. The knight let out a scream and immediately tilted off the back of his horse. In an instant, he was dragged down by countless hands, and after a series of screams, he was dismembered by the imps on the spot. Even the poor warhorse was torn to pieces. Brando could not help but feel a wave of disgust when he saw the imps grabbing the knight's broken limbs and turning toward him with their faces covered in blood. Although it was not that he had never seen such a scene in the game, it was, after all, a product of reconciliation, and was not directly displayed in front of him like this. However, after all, he had been on the battlefield for a long time, and the burning anger in his heart was far stronger than the feeling of nausea. He protected the pale Amandina with one hand, and with a wave of his right hand, the sword flashed, and the 3 imps that pounced on him were suddenly cut into 7 or 8 pieces of minced meat. The stinking rain of blood blended into the rain and sprinkled on the 2 of them. Blood beads and minced meat fell on Amandina, so disgusting that she almost vomited, but she hurriedly covered her mouth with her hand. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Brando quickly took the time to ask. "No," Amandina shook her head weakly. "My lord, take care of your own safety." "I know. Look over there." Someone screamed. Brando looked up and saw that in the Red Sea, several hill-like behemoths were breaking through the waves. Their tall bodies seemed to be made of dense flesh mounds, and their 3 huge heads moved up and down as they galloped, each revealing a scarlet tongue. These monsters rushed down from the hills not far away and crashed into the dense formation of the imps, directly knocking the low-level demons away or trampling them into minced meat. It seemed that they did not need to consider slowing down at all. Cerberus. Behind them, there were more Cerberus, just like a group of sharks converging into the Red Sea. The towering backs exposed in the midst of the monsters were their fins that separated the waves. Brando's heart tightened. The demon's reaction was faster than he expected. He suddenly found that he had underestimated these monsters. He estimated the combat power of these demons based on the level of his own era, but he soon found that these demons seemed to be more powerful than in the game. Close the formation, be careful of their breath. Brando had to remind them loudly, the Shire. I understand, my lord. Under the protection of a few knights, the young wizard held a staff in his left hand and pointed his right hand into the distance, the magic triangle forward. Dragon strike. With a loud bang, the light net expanded in front of the Shire, and a beam of green light shot out from the blazing center, passing through the curtain of rain and drawing a slightly curved straight line along the horizon. The light beam hit the head of a Cerberus and penetrated it diagonally from the back into the cerebellum, completely vaporizing the spine and part of the brain. The other end of the light spear went straight out, and the huge force pushed the hill-like demon back, and its corpse fell far away into a group of imps, crushing countless of them. Then, two low-level Cerberus could not dodge in time and were burned to ashes. The green light beam went forward, unstoppable. Plus 5029 EXP plus 1209 EXP plus 1215 EXP on Brando's retina, the ghostly green numbers were jumping. This number was a little higher than he had expected, but this was not a good thing. It meant that the Cerberus was a little higher than he had expected. To be honest, the players in the game encountered demons very late in the game. At that time, things like the Cerberus were just cannon fodder, and he really did not consider how strong the demons were. But now, it seemed that they were at least at the upper level of the gold level. They were indeed the 6th grade troops of this era. The Shire turned around and released another dragon strike.